Chapter 21. "We'll just sit here," said Barney, "and if we think of anything worthwhile saying, we'll say it. Otherwise, not. Don't imagine you're bound to talk to me." "John Foster says," quoted Valancy, "if you can sit in silence with a person for half an hour and yet be entirely comfortable, you and that person can be friends. If you cannot, friends you'll never be, and you need not waste time in trying." "Evidently John Foster says a sensible thing once in a while," conceded Barney. They sat in silence for a long while. Little rabbits hopped across the road. Once or twice an owl laughed out delightfully. The road beyond them was fringed with the woven shadow lace of trees. Away off to the southwest, the sky was full of silvery little cirrus clouds above the spot where Barney's island must be. Valancy was perfectly happy. Some things dawn on you slowly. Some things come by lightning flashes. Valancy had had a lightning flash. She knew quite well now that she loved Barney. Yesterday she had been all her own. Now she was this man's. Yet he had done nothing, said nothing. He had not even looked at her as a woman. But that didn't matter. Nor did it matter what he was or what he had done. She loved him without any reservations. Everything in her went out wholly to him. She had no wish to stifle or disown her love. She seemed to be his so absolutely that thought apart from him, thought in which he did not predominate, was an impossibility. She had realized, quite simply and fully, that she loved him. In the moment when he was leaning on the car door, explaining that Lady Jane had no gas. She had looked deep into his eyes in the moonlight and had known. In just that infinitesimal space of time, everything was changed. Old things passed away, and all things became new. She was no longer unimportant, little, old maid Valancy Stirling. She was a woman, full of love and therefore rich and significant, justified to herself. Life was no longer empty and futile, and death could cheat her of nothing. Love had cast out her last fear. Love, what a searing, torturing, intolerably sweet thing it was. This possession of body, soul, and mind, with something at its core as fine and remote and purely spiritual as the tiny blue spark in the heart of the unbreakable diamond. No dream had ever been like this. She was no longer solitary. She was one of a vast sisterhood. All the women who had ever loved in the world. Barney need never know it, though she would not in the least have minded his knowing. But she knew it, and it made a tremendous difference to her. Just to love. She did not ask to be loved. It was rapture enough just to sit there beside him in silence, alone in the summer night in the white splendor of moonshine, with the wind blowing down on them out of the pine woods. She had always envied the wind. So free, blowing where it listed, through the hills, over the lakes. What a tang, what a zip it had. What a magic of adventure. Valancy felt as if she had exchanged her shop-worn soul for a fresh one, fire new from the workshop of the gods. As far back as she could look, life had been dull, colorless, savorless. Now she had come to a little patch of violets, purple and fragrant, hers for the plucking. No matter who or what had been in Barney's past, no matter who or what might be in his future, no one else could ever have this perfect hour. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of the moment. "Ever dream of ballooning?" said Barney suddenly. "No," said Valancy. "I do often. Dream of sailing through the clouds, seeing the glories of sunset, spending hours in the midst of a terrific storm with lightning playing above and below you, skimming above a silver cloud floor under a full moon. Wonderful." "It does sound so," said Valancy. "I've stayed on Earth in my dreams." She told him about her blue castle. It was so easy to tell Barney things. One felt he understood everything, even the things you didn't tell him. And then she told him a little of her existence before she came to Roaring Gables. She wanted him to see why she had gone to the dance, up back. "You see, I've never had any real life," she said. "I've just breathed. Every door has always been shut to me." "But you're still young," said Barney. "Oh, I know. Yes, I'm still young, but that's so different from young," said Valancy bitterly. For a moment she was tempted to tell Barney why her years had nothing to do with her future, but she did not. She was not going to think of death tonight. "Though I never was really young," she went on, "until tonight," she added in her heart. "I never had a life like other girls. You couldn't understand. Why, she had a desperate desire that Barney should know the worst about her. I didn't even love my mother. Isn't it awful that I don't love my mother? Rather awful, for her, said Barney drily. Oh, she didn't know it. She took my love for granted. And I wasn't any use or comfort to her or anybody. I was just a vegetable, and I got tired of it. That's why I came to keep house for Mr. Gay and look after Sissy. And I suppose your people thought you'd gone mad. They did, and do literally, said Valancy, but it's a comfort to them. They'd rather believe me mad than bad. There's no other alternative. But I've been living since I came to Mr. Gay's. It's been a delightful experience. I suppose I'll pay for it when I have to go back, but I'll have had it. That's true, said Barney. If you buy your experience, it's your own. So it's no matter how much you pay for it. Somebody else's experience can never be yours. Well, it's a funny old world. Do you think it really is old? Asked Valancy dreamily. I never believed that in June. It seems so young tonight, somehow. In that quivering moonlight, like a young, white girl, waiting. Moonlight here on the verge of Upback is different from moonlight anywhere else, agreed Barney. It always makes me feel so clean, somehow, body and soul. And of course the age of gold always comes back in spring. It was 10 o'clock now. A dragon of black cloud ate up the moon. The spring air grew chill, Valancy shivered. Barney reached back into the innards of Lady Jane and clawed up an old, tobacco-scented overcoat. Put that on, he ordered. Don't you want it yourself? Protested Valancy. No, I'm not going to have you catching cold on my hands. Oh, I won't catch cold. I haven't had a cold since I came to Mr. Gay's, though I've done the foolishest things. It's funny, too. I used to have them all the time. I feel so selfish taking your coat. You've sneezed 3 times. No use winding up your experience up back with grip or pneumonia. He pulled it up tight about her throat and buttoned it on her. Valancy submitted with secret delight. How nice it was to have someone look after you so. She snuggled down into the tobacco-y folds and wished the night could last forever. 10 minutes later a car swooped down on them from up back. Barney sprang from Lady Jane and waved his hand. The car came to a stop beside them. Valancy saw Uncle Wellington and Olive gazing at her in horror from it. So Uncle Wellington had got a car, and he must have been spending the evening up at Mistowi's with Cousin Herbert. Valancy almost laughed aloud at the expression on his face as he recognized her. The pompous, bewhiskered old humbug. Can you let me have enough gas to take me to Deerwood? Barney was asking politely, but Uncle Wellington was not attending to him. Valancy, how came you here? He said sternly. By chance or God's grace, said Valancy. With this jailbird, at 10 o'clock at night, said Uncle Wellington. Valancy turned to Barney. The moon had escaped from its dragon, and in its light her eyes were full of deviltry. Are you a jailbird? Does it matter? Said Barney, gleams of fun in his eyes. Not to me. I only asked out of curiosity, continued Valancy. Then I won't tell you. I never satisfy curiosity. He turned to Uncle Wellington and his voice changed subtly. Mr. Stirling, I asked you if you could let me have some gas. If you can, well and good. If not, we are only delaying you unnecessarily. Uncle Wellington was in a horrible dilemma. To give gas to this shameless pair, but not to give it to them. To go away and leave them there in the Mistowi's woods, until daylight, likely. It was better to give it to them and let them get out of sight before anyone else saw them. Got anything to get gas in? He grunted surlily. Barney produced a 2-gallon measure from Lady Jane. The 2 men went to the rear of the Stirling car and began manipulating the tap. Valancy stole sly glances at Olive over the collar of Barney's coat. Olive was sitting grimly staring straight ahead with an outraged expression. She did not mean to take any notice of Valancy. Olive had her own secret reasons for feeling outraged. Cecil had been in Deerwood lately and of course had heard all about Valancy. He agreed that her mind was deranged and was exceedingly anxious to find out whence the derangement had been inherited. It was a serious thing to have in the family, a very serious thing. One had to think of one's descendants. She got it from the Wansbarris, said Olive positively. There's nothing like that in the Stirlings, nothing. I hope not, I certainly hope not, Cecil had responded dubiously. But then, to go out as a servant, for that is what it practically amounts to. Your cousin. Poor Olive felt the implication. The Port Lawrence Prices were not accustomed to ally themselves with families whose members worked out. Valancy could not resist temptation. She leaned forward. Olive, does it hurt? Olive bit, stiffly. Does what hurt? Looking like that. For a moment Olive resolved she would take no further notice of Valancy. Then duty came uppermost. She must not miss the opportunity. Doss, she implored, leaning forward also, won't you come home? Come home tonight? Valancy yawned. You sound like a revival meeting, she said. You really do. If you will come back, all will be forgiven. Yes, said Olive eagerly. Wouldn't it be splendid if she could induce the prodigal daughter to return? We'll never cast it up to you. Doss, there are nights when I cannot sleep for thinking of you. And me having the time of my life, said Valancy, laughing. Doss, I can't believe you're bad. I've always said you couldn't be bad. I don't believe I can be, said Valancy. I'm afraid I'm hopelessly proper. I've been sitting here for 3 hours with Barney Snaith, and he hasn't even tried to kiss me. I wouldn't have minded if he had, Olive. Valancy was still leaning forward. Her little hat with its crimson rose was tilted down over one eye. Olive stared. In the moonlight Valancy's eyes, Valancy's smile. What had happened to Valancy? She looked, not pretty, Doss couldn't be pretty, but provocative, fascinating. Yes, abominably so. Olive drew back. It was beneath her dignity to say more. After all, Valancy must be both mad and bad. Thanks, that's enough, said Barney behind the car. Much obliged, Mr. Stirling. 2 gallons, 70 cents. Thank you. Uncle Wellington climbed foolishly and feebly into his car. He wanted to give Snaith a piece of his mind, but dared not. Who knew what the creature might do if provoked? No doubt he carried firearms. Uncle Wellington looked indecisively at Valancy, but Valancy had turned her back on him and was watching Barney pour the gas into Lady Jane's maw. Drive on, said Olive decisively. There's no use in waiting here. Let me tell you what she said to me. The little hussy. The shameless little hussy, said Uncle Wellington. Chapter 22. The next thing the Stirlings heard was that Valancy had been seen with Barney Snaith in a movie theater in Port Lawrence and after it at supper in a Chinese restaurant there. This was quite true, and no one was more surprised at it than Valancy herself. Barney had come along in Lady Jane one dim twilight and told Valancy unceremoniously if she wanted a drive to hop in. I'm going to the port. Will you go there with me? His eyes were teasing, and there was a bit of defiance in his voice. Valancy, who did not conceal from herself that she would have gone anywhere with him to any place, hopped in without more ado. They tore into and through Deerwood. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles, taking a little air on the veranda, saw them whirl by in a cloud of dust and sought comfort in each other's eyes. Valancy, who in some dim pre-existence had been afraid of a car, was hatless and her hair was blowing wildly round her face. She would certainly come down with bronchitis and die at Roaring Abel's. She wore a low-neck dress and her arms were bare. That Snaith creature was in his shirt sleeves, smoking a pipe. They were going at the rate of 40 miles an hour, 60, Cousin Stickles averred. Lady Jane could hit the pike when she wanted to. Valancy waved her hand gaily to her relatives. As for Mrs. Frederick, she was wishing she knew how to go into hysterics. Was it for this, she demanded in hollow tones, that I suffered the pangs of motherhood? I will not believe, said Cousin Stickles solemnly, that our prayers will not yet be answered. Who will protect that unfortunate girl when I am gone? Moaned Mrs. Frederick. As for Valancy, she was wondering if it could really be only a few weeks since she had sat there with them on that veranda, hating the rubber plant, pestered with teasing questions like black flies, always thinking of appearances, cowed because of Aunt Wellington's teaspoons and Uncle Benjamin's money, poverty-stricken, afraid of everybody, envying Olive, a slave to moth-eaten traditions, nothing to hope for or expect, and now every day was a gay adventure. Lady Jane flew over the 15 miles between Deerwood and the port, through the port. The way Barney went past traffic policemen was not holy. The lights were beginning to twinkle out like stars in the clear, lemon-hued twilight air. This was the only time Valancy ever really liked the town, and she was crazy with the delight of speeding. Was it possible she had ever been afraid of a car? She was perfectly happy, riding beside Barney. Not that she deluded herself into thinking it had any significance. She knew quite well that Barney had asked her to go on the impulse of the moment, an impulse born of a feeling of pity for her and her starved little dreams. She was looking tired after a wakeful night with a heart attack, followed by a busy day. She had so little fun. He'd give her an outing for once. Besides, Abel was in the kitchen, at the point of drunkenness where he was declaring he did not believe in God and beginning to sing ribald songs. It was just as well she should be out of the way for a while. Barney knew Roaring Abel's repertoire. They went to the movie. Valancy had never been to a movie. And then, finding a nice hunger upon them, they went and had fried chicken, unbelievably delicious, in the Chinese restaurant, after which they rattled home again, leaving a devastating trail of scandal behind them. Mrs. Frederick gave up going to church altogether. She could not endure her friends' pitying glances and questions. But Cousin Stickles went every Sunday. She said they had been given a cross to bear. Chapter 23. On one of Sissy's wakeful nights, she told Valancy her poor little story. They were sitting by the open window. Sissy could not get her breath lying down that night. An inglorious gibbous moon was hanging over the wooded hills, and in its spectral light Sissy looked frail and lovely and incredibly young. A child. It did not seem possible that she could have lived through all the passion and pain and shame of her story. He was stopping at the hotel across the lake. He used to come over in his canoe at night. We met in the pines down the shore. He was a young college student. His father was a rich man in Toronto. Oh, Valancy, I didn't mean to be bad. I didn't, indeed. But I loved him so. I love him yet. I'll always love him. And I didn't know some things. I didn't understand. Then his father came and took him away. And, after a little, I found out, oh, Valancy, I was so frightened. I didn't know what to do. I wrote him, and he came. He said he would marry me, Valancy. And why? Oh, Valancy, he didn't love me anymore. I saw that at a glance. He was just offering to marry me because he thought he ought to, because he was sorry for me. He wasn't bad, but he was so young, and what was I that he should keep on loving me? Never mind making excuses for him, said Valancy a bit shortly. So you wouldn't marry him? I couldn't, not when he didn't love me anymore. Somehow, I can't explain. It seemed a worse thing to do than the other. He argued a little, but he went away. Do you think I did right, Valancy? Yes, I do. You did right. But don't blame him, dear. Please don't. Let's not talk about him at all. There's no need. I wanted to tell you how it was. I didn't want you to think me bad. I never did think so. Yes, I felt that, whenever you came. Oh, Valancy, what you've been to me. I can never tell you, but God will bless you for it. I know he will, with what measure ye meet. Sissy sobbed for a few minutes in Valancy's arms. Then she wiped her eyes. Well, that's almost all. I came home. I wasn't really so very unhappy. I suppose I should have been, but I wasn't. Father wasn't hard on me, and my baby was so sweet while he lived. I was even happy. I loved him so much, the dear little thing. He was so sweet, Valancy, with such lovely blue eyes, and little rings of pale gold hair like silk floss, and tiny dimpled hands. I used to bite his satin-smooth little face all over, softly, so as not to hurt him, you know. I know, said Valancy, wincing. I know. A woman always knows and dreams. And he was all mine. Nobody else had any claim on him. When he died, oh, Valancy, I thought I must die too. I didn't see how anybody could endure such anguish and live. To see his dear little eyes and know he would never open them again. To miss his warm little body nestled against mine at night and think of him sleeping alone and cold, his wee face under the hard frozen earth. It was so awful for the first year. After that it was a little easier. One didn't keep thinking this day last year. But I was so glad when I found out I was dying. Who could endure life if it were not for the hope of death? Murmured Valancy softly. It was of course a quotation from some book of John Foster's. I'm glad I've told you all about it, sighed Sissy. I wanted you to know. Sissy died a few nights after that. Roaring Abel was away. When Valancy saw the change that had come over Sissy's face, she wanted to telephone for the doctor. But Sissy wouldn't let her. Valancy, why should you? He can do nothing for me. I've known for several days that this was near. Let me die in peace, dear. Just holding your hand. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Tell Father goodbye for me. He's always been as good to me as he knew how. And Barney? Somehow, I think that Barney. But a spasm of coughing interrupted and exhausted her. She fell asleep when it was over, still holding to Valancy's hand. Valancy sat there in the silence. She was not frightened, or even sorry. At sunrise Sissy died. She opened her eyes and looked past Valancy at something. Something that made her smile suddenly and happily. And, smiling, she died. Valancy crossed Sissy's hands on her breast and went to the open window. In the eastern sky, amid the fires of sunrise, an old moon was hanging, as slender and lovely as a new moon. Valancy had never seen an old moon before. She watched it pale and fade until it paled and faded out of sight in the living rose of day. A little pool in the barrens shone in the sunrise like a great golden lily. But the world suddenly seemed a colder place to Valancy. Again nobody needed her. She was not in the least sorry Cecilia was dead. She was only sorry for all her suffering in life. But nobody could ever hurt her again. Valancy had always thought death dreadful. But Sissy had died so quietly, so pleasantly, and at the very last, something had made up to her for everything. She was lying there now, in her white sleep, looking like a child. Beautiful, all the lines of shame and pain gone. Roaring Abel drove in, justifying his name. Valancy went down and told him. The shock sobered him at once. He slumped down on the seat of his buggy, his great head hanging. Sissy dead, he said vacantly. I didn't think it would have come so soon. Dead. She used to run down the lane to meet me with a little white rose stuck in her hair. Sissy used to be a pretty little girl, and a good little girl. She has always been a good little girl, said Valancy. Chapter 24. Valancy herself made Sissy ready for burial. No hands but hers should touch that pitiful, wasted little body. The old house was spotless on the day of the funeral. Barney Snaith was not there. He had done all he could to help Valancy before it. He had shrouded the pale Cecilia in white roses from the garden, and then had gone back to his island. But everybody else was there. All Deerwood and up back came. They forgave Sissy splendidly at last. Mr. Bradley gave a very beautiful funeral address. Valancy had wanted her old Free Methodist man, but Roaring Abel was obdurate. He was a Presbyterian and no one but a Presbyterian minister should bury his daughter. Mr. Bradley was very tactful. He avoided all dubious points, and it was plain to be seen he hoped for the best. 6 reputable citizens of Deerwood bore Cecilia, gay to her grave in decorous Deerwood Cemetery. Among them was Uncle Wellington. The Stirlings all came to the funeral, men and women. They had had a family conclave over it. Surely now that Sissy Gay was dead, Valancy would come home. She simply could not stay there with Roaring Abel. That being the case, the wisest course, decreed Uncle James, was to attend the funeral, legitimize the whole thing, so to speak. Show Deerwood that Valancy had really done a most creditable deed in going to nurse poor Cecilia Gay, and that her family backed her up in it. Death, the miracle worker, suddenly made the thing quite respectable. If Valancy would return to home and decency, while public opinion was under its influence, all might yet be well. Society was suddenly forgetting all Cecilia's wicked doings and remembering what a pretty, modest little thing she had been. And motherless, you know, motherless. It was the psychological moment, said Uncle James. So the Stirlings went to the funeral. Even Cousin Gladys Neuritis allowed her to come. Cousin Stickles was there, her bonnet dripping all over her face, crying as woefully as if Sissy had been her nearest and dearest. Funerals always brought Cousin Stickles' own sad bereavement back. and Uncle Wellington was a pallbearer. Valancy, pale, subdued-looking, her slanted eyes smudged with purple, in her snuff-brown dress, moving quietly about, finding seats for people, consulting in undertones with minister and undertaker, marshalling the mourners into the parlor, was so decorous and proper and Stirlingish that her family took heart of grace. This was not, could not be, the girl who had sat all night in the woods with Barney Snaith, who had gone tearing bareheaded through Deerwood and Port Lawrence. This was the Valancy they knew. Really, surprisingly capable and efficient. Perhaps she had always been kept down a bit too much. Amelia really was rather strict, hadn't had a chance to show what was in her. So thought the Stirlings. And Edward Beck, from the Port Road, a widower with a large family who was beginning to took notice of Valancy and thought she might make a mighty fine second wife. No beauty, but a 50-year-old widower. Mr. Beck told himself very reasonably, couldn't expect everything. Altogether, it seemed that Valancy's matrimonial chances were never so bright as they were at Cecilia Gay's funeral. What the Stirlings and Edward Beck would have thought had they known the back of Valancy's mind must be left to the imagination. Valancy was hating the funeral, hating the people who came to stare with curiosity at Cecilia's marble-white face, hating the smugness, hating the dragging, melancholy singing, hating Mr. Bradley's cautious platitudes. If she could have had her absurd way, there would have been no funeral at all. She would have covered Sissy over with flowers, shut her away from prying eyes, and buried her beside her nameless little baby in the grassy burying ground under the pines of the up-back church, with a bit of kindly prayer from the old Free Methodist minister. She remembered Sissy saying once, "I wish I could be buried deep in the heart of the woods where nobody would ever come to say, 'Sissy Gay is buried here,' and tell over my miserable story." But this, however, it would soon be over. Valancy knew, if the Stirlings and Edward Beck didn't, exactly what she intended to do then. She had lain awake all the preceding night thinking about it, and finally deciding on it. When the funeral procession had left the house, Mrs. Frederick sought out Valancy in the kitchen. "My child," she said tremulously, "you'll come home now?" "Home," said Valancy absently. She was getting on an apron and calculating how much tea she must put to steep for supper. There would be several guests from up back, distant relatives of the Gays who had not remembered them for years, and she was so tired she wished she could borrow a pair of legs from the cat. "Yes, home," said Mrs. Frederick, with a touch of asperity. "I suppose you won't dream of staying here now, alone with Roaring Abel." "Oh, no, I'm not going to stay here," said Valancy. "Of course, I'll have to stay for a day or two, to put the house in order generally, but that will be all. Excuse me, Mother, won't you? I've a frightful lot to do. All those up-back people will be here to supper." Mrs. Frederick retreated in considerable relief, and the Stirlings went home with lighter hearts. "We will just treat her as if nothing had happened when she comes back," decreed Uncle Benjamin. "That will be the best plan, just as if nothing had happened." Chapter 25. On the evening of the day after the funeral, Roaring Abel went off for a spree. He had been sober for 4 whole days and could endure it no longer. Before he went, Valancy told him she would be going away the next day. Roaring Abel was sorry and said so. A distant cousin from up back was coming to keep house for him, quite willing to do so now since there was no sick girl to wait on, but Abel was not under any delusions concerning her. "She won't be like you, my girl." "Well, I'm obliged to you. You helped me out of a bad hole, and I won't forget it. And I won't forget what you did for Sissy. I'm your friend, and if you ever want any of the Stirlings spanked and sot in a corner, send for me. I'm going to wet my whistle. Lord, but I'm dry. Don't reckon I'll be back afore tomorrow night. So if you're going home tomorrow, goodbye now." "I may go home tomorrow," said Valancy, "but I'm not going back to Deerwood." "Not going?" "You'll find the key on the woodshed nail," interrupted Valancy, politely and unmistakably. "The dog will be in the barn and the cat in the cellar. Don't forget to feed her till your cousin comes. The pantry is full and I made bread and pies today. Goodbye, Mr. Gay. You have been very kind to me and I appreciate it. We've had a decent time of it together, and that's a fact," said Roaring Abel. You're the best small sport in the world, and your little finger is worth the whole Stirling clan tied together. Goodbye and good luck." Valancy went out to the garden. Her legs trembled a little, but otherwise she felt and looked composed. She held something tightly in her hand. The garden was lying in the magic of the warm, odorous July twilight. A few stars were out and the robins were calling through the velvety silences of the barrens. Valancy stood by the gate expectantly. Would he come? If he did not, he was coming. Valancy heard Lady Jane Grey far back in the woods. Her breath came a little more quickly. Nearer and nearer. She could see Lady Jane now, bumping down the lane. Nearer, nearer. He was there. He had sprung from the car and was leaning over the gate, looking at her. "Going home, Miss Stirling?" "I don't know, yet," said Valancy slowly. Her mind was made up, with no shadow of turning, but the moment was very tremendous. "I thought I'd run down and ask if there was anything I could do for you," said Barney. Valancy took it with a canter. "Yes, there is something you can do for me," she said, evenly and distinctly. "Will you marry me?" For a moment Barney was silent. There was no particular expression on his face. Then he gave an odd laugh. "Come, now. I knew luck was just waiting around the corner for me. All the signs have been pointing that way today. Wait." Valancy lifted her hand. "I'm in earnest, but I want to get my breath after that question. Of course, with my bringing up, I realize perfectly well that this is one of the things a lady should not do. But why? For two reasons." Valancy was still a little breathless, but she looked Barney straight in the eyes, while all the dead Stirlings revolved rapidly in their graves, and the living ones did nothing because they did not know that Valancy was at that moment proposing lawful marriage to the notorious Barney Snaith. "The first reason is, Valancy tried to say, 'I love you,' but could not. She had to take refuge in a pretended flippancy. 'I'm crazy about you.' The second is this." She handed him Dr. Trent's letter. Barney opened it with the air of a man thankful to find some safe, sane thing to do. As he read it, his face changed. He understood, more perhaps than Valancy wanted him to. "Are you sure nothing can be done for you?" Valancy did not misunderstand the question. "Yes. You know Dr. Trent's reputation in regard to heart disease. I haven't long to live, perhaps only a few months, a few weeks. I want to live them. I can't go back to Deerwood. You know what my life was like there. And, she managed it this time, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. That's all." Barney folded his arms on the gate and looked gravely enough at a white, saucy star that was winking at him just over roaring Abel's kitchen chimney. "You don't know anything about me. I may be a murderer." "No, I don't. You may be something dreadful. Everything they say of you may be true. But it doesn't matter to me." "You care that much for me, Valancy?" said Barney incredulously, looking away from the star and into her eyes, her strange, mysterious eyes. "I care, that much," said Valancy in a low voice. She was trembling. He had called her by her name for the first time. It was sweeter than another man's caress could have been just to hear him say her name like that. "If we are going to get married," said Barney, speaking suddenly in a casual, matter-of-fact voice, "some things must be understood." "Everything must be understood," said Valancy. "I have things I want to hide," said Barney coolly. "You are not to ask me about them." "I won't," said Valancy. "You must never ask to see my mail." "Never. And we are never to pretend anything to each other." "We won't," said Valancy. "You won't even have to pretend you like me. If you marry me, I know you're only doing it out of pity. And we'll never tell a lie to each other about anything, a big lie or a petty lie." "Especially a petty lie," agreed Valancy. "And you'll have to live back on my island. I won't live anywhere else." "That's partly why I want to marry you," said Valancy. Barney peered at her. "I believe you mean it. Well, let's get married then." "Thank you," said Valancy, with a sudden return of primness. She would have been much less embarrassed if he had refused her. "I suppose I haven't any right to make conditions, but I'm going to make one. You are never to refer to my heart or my liability to sudden death. You are never to urge me to be careful. You are to forget, absolutely forget, that I'm not perfectly healthy. I have written a letter to my mother. Here it is, you are to keep it. I have explained everything in it. If I drop dead suddenly, as I likely will do, it will exonerate me in the eyes of your kindred from the suspicion of having poisoned you, said Barney with a grin. Exactly. Valancy laughed gaily. Dear me, I'm glad this is over. It has been a bit of an ordeal. You see, I'm not in the habit of going about asking men to marry me. It is so nice of you not to refuse me or offer to be a brother. I'll go to the port tomorrow and get a license. We can be married tomorrow evening. Dr. Stirling, I suppose? Heavens, no. Valancy shuddered. Besides, he wouldn't do it. He'd shake his forefinger at me, and I'd jilt you at the altar. No, I want my old Mr. Towers to marry me. Will you marry me as I stand? Demanded Barney. A passing car, full of tourists, honked loudly. It seemed derisively. Valancy looked at him. Blue homespun shirt, nondescript hat, muddy overalls. Unshaved. Yes, she said. Barney put his hands over the gate and took her little, cold ones gently in his. Valancy, he said, trying to speak lightly, of course I'm not in love with you. Never thought of such a thing as being in love. But, do you know, I've always thought you were a bit of a dear. Chapter 26. The next day passed for Valancy like a dream. She could not make herself, or anything she did seem real. She saw nothing of Barney, though she expected he must go rattling past on his way to the port for a license. Perhaps he had changed his mind. But at dusk, the lights of Lady Jane suddenly swooped over the crest of the wooded hill beyond the lane. Valancy was waiting at the gate for her bridegroom. She wore her green dress and her green hat because she had nothing else to wear. She did not look or feel at all bride-like. She really looked like a wild elf strayed out of the greenwood. But that did not matter. Nothing at all mattered except that Barney was coming for her. Ready, said Barney, stopping Lady Jane with some new, horrible noises. Yes. Valancy stepped in and sat down. Barney was in his blue shirt and overalls. But they were clean overalls. He was smoking a villainous-looking pipe, and he was bareheaded. But he had a pair of oddly smart boots on under his shabby overalls. And he was shaved. They clattered into Deerwood and through Deerwood and hit the long, wooded road to the port. Haven't changed your mind? Said Barney. No. Have you? No. That was their whole conversation on the 15 miles. Everything was more dreamlike than ever. Valancy didn't know whether she felt happy, or terrified, or just plain fool. Then the lights of Port Lawrence were about them. Valancy felt as if she were surrounded by the gleaming, hungry eyes of hundreds of great, stealthy panthers. Barney briefly asked where Mr. Towers lived, and Valancy as briefly told him. They stopped before the shabby little house in an unfashionable street. They went into the small, shabby parlor. Barney produced his license. So he had got it. Also a ring. This thing was real. She, Valancy Stirling, was actually on the point of being married. They were standing up together before Mr. Towers. Valancy heard Mr. Towers and Barney saying things. She heard some other person saying things. She herself was thinking of the way she had once planned to be married. Away back in her early teens when such a thing had not seemed impossible. White silk and tulle veil and orange blossoms. No bridesmaid. But one flower girl, in a frock of cream shadow lace over pale pink, with a wreath of flowers in her hair, carrying a basket of roses and lilies of the valley. And the groom, a noble-looking creature, irreproachably clad in whatever the fashion of the day decreed. Valancy lifted her eyes and saw herself and Barney in the little, slanting, distorting mirror over the mantelpiece. She in her odd, unbridled green hat and dress, Barney in shirt and overalls. But it was Barney. That was all that mattered. No veil, no flowers, no guests, no presents, no wedding cake, but just Barney. For all the rest of her life there would be Barney. Mrs. Snaith, I hope you will be very happy, Mr. Towers was saying. He had not seemed surprised at their appearance, not even at Barney's overalls. He had seen plenty of queer weddings, up back. He did not know Valancy was one of the Deerwood Stirlings. He did not even know there were Deerwood Stirlings. He did not know Barney Snaith was a fugitive from justice. Really, he was an incredibly ignorant old man. Therefore he married them and gave them his blessing very gently and solemnly and prayed for them that night after they had gone away. His conscience did not trouble him at all. What a nice way to get married, Barney was saying as he put Lady Jane in gear. No fuss and flub-dub. I never supposed it was half so easy. For heaven's sake, said Valancy suddenly, let's forget we are married and talk as if we weren't. I can't stand another drive like the one we had coming in. Barney howled and threw Lady Jane into high with an infernal noise. And I thought I was making it easy for you, he said. You didn't seem to want to talk. I didn't, but I wanted you to talk. I don't want you to make love to me, but I want you to act like an ordinary human being. Tell me about this island of yours. What sort of a place is it? The jolliest place in the world. You're going to love it. The first time I saw it, I loved it. Old Tom McMurray owned it then. He built the little shack on it, lived there in winter, and rented it to Toronto people in summer. I bought it from him, became by that one simple transaction a landed proprietor owning a house and an island. There is something so satisfying in owning a whole island. And isn't an uninhabited island a charming idea? I'd wanted to own one ever since I'd read Robinson Crusoe. It seemed too good to be true. And beauty. Most of the scenery belongs to the government, but they don't tax you for looking at it, and the moon belongs to everybody. You won't find my shack very tidy. I suppose you'll want to make it tidy. Yes, said Valancy honestly. I have to be tidy. I don't really want to be, but untidiness hurts me. Yes, I'll have to tidy up your shack. I was prepared for that, said Barney, with a hollow groan. But, continued Valancy relentingly, I won't insist on your wiping your feet when you come in. No, you'll only sweep up after me with the air of a martyr, said Barney. Well, anyway, you can't tidy the lean-to. You can't even enter it. The door will be locked and I shall keep the key. Bluebeard's chamber, said Valancy. I shan't even think of it. I don't care how many wives you have hanging up in it, so long as they're really dead. Dead as doornails. You can do as you like in the rest of the house. There's not much of it, just one big living room and one small bedroom. Well built, though. Old Tom loved his job. The beams of our house are cedar and the rafters fir. Our living room windows face west and east. It's wonderful to have a room where you can see both sunrise and sunset. I have 2 cats there, Banjo and Good Luck. Adorable animals. Banjo is a big, enchanting, gray devil cat. Striped, of course. I don't care a hang for any cat that hasn't stripes. I never knew a cat who could swear as genteelly and effectively as Banjo. His only fault is that he snores horribly when he is asleep. Luck is a dainty little cat, always looking wistfully at you, as if he wanted to tell you something. Maybe he will pull it off sometime. Once in 1,000 years, one cat is allowed to speak. My cats are philosophers. Neither of them ever cries over spilt milk. 2 old crows live in a pine tree on the point and are reasonably neighborly. Call him Nip and Tuck. And I have a demure little tame owl. Name, Leander. I brought him up from a baby and he lives over on the mainland and chuckles to himself o' nights. And bats, it's a great place for bats at night. Scared of bats? No, I like them. So do I. Nice, queer, uncanny, mysterious creatures. Coming from nowhere, going nowhere. Swoop. Banjo likes him, too. Eats him. I have a canoe and a disappearing propeller boat. Went to the port in it today to get my license. Quieter than Lady Jane. I thought you hadn't gone at all, that you had changed your mind, admitted Valancy. Barney laughed. The laugh Valancy did not like. The little, bitter, cynical laugh. I never change my mind, he said shortly. They went back through Deerwood, up the Muskoka road, past roaring Abels, over the rocky, daisied lane. The dark pine woods swallowed them up. Through the pine woods, where the air was sweet with the incense of the unseen, fragile bells of the lineas that carpeted the banks of the trail, out to the shore of Mistawis. Lady Jane must be left here. They got out. Barney led the way down a little path to the edge of the lake. There's our island, he said gloatingly. Valancy looked and looked and looked again. There was a diaphanous, lilac mist on the lake, shrouding the island. Through it the two enormous pine trees that clasped hands over Barney's shack loomed out like dark turrets. Behind them was a sky still rose-hued in the afterlight, and a pale young moon. Valancy shivered like a tree the wind stirs suddenly. Something seemed to sweep over her soul. "My blue castle," she said. "Oh, my blue castle." They got into the canoe and paddled out to it. They left behind the realm of everyday and things known and landed on a realm of mystery and enchantment where anything might happen. Anything might be true. Barney lifted Valancy out of the canoe and swung her to a lichen-covered rock under a young pine tree. His arms were about her, and suddenly his lips were on hers. Valancy found herself shivering with the rapture of her first kiss. "Welcome home, dear," Barney was saying. Chapter 27. Cousin Georgiana came down the lane leading up to her little house. She lived half a mile out of Deerwood, and she wanted to go into Amelia's and find out if Doss had come home yet. Cousin Georgiana was anxious to see Doss. She had something very important to tell her. Something, she was sure, Doss would be delighted to hear. Poor Doss. She had had rather a dull life of it. Cousin Georgiana owned to herself that she would not like to live under Amelia's thumb. But that would be all changed now. Cousin Georgiana felt tremendously important. For the time being, she quite forgot to wonder which of them would go next. And here was Doss herself, coming along the road from Roaring Abel's in such a queer green dress and hat. Talk about luck. Cousin Georgiana would have a chance to impart her wonderful secret right away, with nobody else about to interrupt. It was, you might say, a providence. Valancy, who had been living for 4 days on her enchanted island, had decided that she might as well go into Deerwood and tell her relatives that she was married. Otherwise, finding that she had disappeared from Roaring Abel's, they might get out a search warrant for her. Barney had offered to drive her in, but she had preferred to go alone. She smiled very radiantly at Cousin Georgiana, who, she remembered, as of someone known a long time ago, had really been not a bad little creature. Valancy was so happy that she could have smiled at anybody, even Uncle James. She was not averse to Cousin Georgiana's company. Already, since the houses along the road were becoming numerous, she was conscious that curious eyes were looking at her from every window. "I suppose you're going home, dear Doss?" said Cousin Georgiana as she shook hands, furtively eyeing Valancy's dress and wondering if she had any petticoat on at all. "Sooner or later," said Valancy cryptically. "Then I'll go along with you. I've been wanting to see you very especially, Doss dear. I've something quite wonderful to tell you." "Yes," said Valancy absently. What on earth was Cousin Georgiana looking so mysterious and important about? But did it matter? No. Nothing mattered but Barney and the blue castle up back in Mistawey's. "Who do you suppose called to see me the other day?" asked Cousin Georgiana archly. Valancy couldn't guess. "Edward Beck." Cousin Georgiana lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "Edward Beck." Why the italics? And was Cousin Georgiana blushing? "Who on earth is Edward Beck?" asked Valancy indifferently. Cousin Georgiana stared. "Surely you remember Edward Beck," she said reproachfully. "He lives in that lovely house on the Port Lawrence Road, and he comes to our church regularly. You must remember him." "Oh, I think I do now," said Valancy with an effort of memory. "He's that old man with a one on his forehead and dozens of children, who always sits in the pew by the door, isn't he?" "Not dozens of children, dear. Oh no, not dozens. Not even 1 dozen. Only 9. At least only 9 that count. The rest are dead. He isn't old. He's only about 48. The prime of life, Doss. And what does it matter about a one?" "Nothing, of course," agreed Valancy quite sincerely. It certainly did not matter to her whether Edward Beck had a 1 or a dozen wins or no one at all. But Valancy was getting vaguely suspicious. There was certainly an air of suppressed triumph about Cousin Georgiana. Could it be possible that Cousin Georgiana was thinking of marrying again? Marrying Edward Beck? Absurd. Cousin Georgiana was 65 if she were a day, and her little anxious face was as closely covered with fine wrinkles as if she had been 100. But still. "My dear," said Cousin Georgiana, "Edward Beck wants to marry you." Valancy stared at Cousin Georgiana for a moment. Then she wanted to go off into a peal of laughter, but she only said, "Me? Yes, you. He fell in love with you at the funeral, and he came to consult me about it. I was such a friend of his first wife, you know. He is very much in earnest, Dossie, and it's a wonderful chance for you. He's very well off, and you know, you. I am not so young as I once was, agreed Valancy. To her that hath shall be given. Do you really think I would make a good stepmother, Cousin Georgiana? I'm sure you would. You were always so fond of children. But 9 is such a family to start with, objected Valancy gravely. The 2 oldest are grown up, and the 3rd almost. That leaves only 6 that really count. And most of them are boys. So much easier to bring up than girls. There's an excellent book, Health Care of the Growing Child. Gladys has a copy, I think. It would be such a help to you. And there are books about morals. You'd manage nicely. Of course I told Mr. Beck that I thought you would. Jump at him, supplied Valancy. Oh, no, dear. I wouldn't use such an indelicate expression. I told him I thought you would consider his proposal favorably. And you will, won't you, dearie? There's only one obstacle, said Valancy dreamily. You see, I'm married already. Married? Cousin Georgiana stopped stock-still and stared at Valancy. Married? Yes. I was married to Barney Snaith last Tuesday evening in Port Lawrence. There was a convenient gatepost hard by. Cousin Georgiana took firm hold of it. Doss, dear, I'm an old woman. Are you trying to make fun of me? Not at all. I'm only telling you the truth. For heaven's sake, Cousin Georgiana, Valancy was alarmed by certain symptoms. Don't go crying here on the public road. Cousin Georgiana choked back the tears and gave a little moan of despair instead. Oh, Doss, what have you done? What have you done? I've just been telling you. I've got married, said Valancy, calmly and patiently. To that Barney Snaith. Why, they say he's had a dozen wives already. I'm the only one round at present, said Valancy. What will your poor mother say? Moaned Cousin Georgiana. Come along with me in here, if you want to know, said Valancy. I'm on my way to tell her now. Cousin Georgiana let go the gatepost cautiously and found that she could stand alone. She meekly trotted on beside Valancy, who suddenly seemed quite a different person in her eyes. Cousin Georgiana had a tremendous respect for a married woman, but it was terrible to think of what the poor girl had done. So rash, so reckless. Of course Valancy must be stark mad, but she seemed so happy in her madness that Cousin Georgiana had a momentary conviction that it would be a pity if the clan tried to scold her back to sanity. She had never seen that look in Valancy's eyes before. But what would Amelia say? And Ben? To marry a man you know nothing about, thought Cousin Georgiana aloud. I know more about him than I know of Edward Beck, said Valancy. Edward Beck goes to church, said Cousin Georgiana. Does your husband? He has promised that he will go with me on fine Sundays, said Valancy. When they turned in at the Stirling gate, Valancy gave an exclamation of surprise. Look at my rose bush. Why, it's blooming. It was covered with blossoms. Great, crimson, velvety blossoms. Fragrant, glowing, wonderful. My cutting it to pieces must have done it good, said Valancy, laughing. She gathered a handful of the blossoms. They would look well on the supper table of the veranda at Mistowi's, and went, still laughing, up the walk, conscious that Olive was standing on the steps. Olive, goddess-like in loveliness, looking down with a slight frown on her forehead. Olive, beautiful, insolent, her full form voluptuous in its swathings of rose silk and lace, her golden brown hair curling richly under her big, white-frilled hat, her color ripe and melting. Beautiful, thought Valancy coolly, but, as if she suddenly saw her cousin through new eyes, without the slightest touch of distinction. So Valancy had come home, thank goodness, thought Olive. But Valancy was not looking like a repentant, returned prodigal. This was the cause of Olive's frown. She was looking triumphant, graceless. That outlandish dress, that queer hat, those hands full of blood-red roses. Yet there was something about both dress and hat, as Olive instantly felt, that was entirely lacking in her own attire. This deepened the frown. She put out a condescending hand. So you're back, Doss? Very warm day, isn't it? Did you walk in? Yes. Coming in? Oh, no. I've just been in. I've come often to comfort poor Auntie. She's been so lonesome. I'm going to Mrs. Bartlett's tea. I have to help poor. She's giving it for her cousin from Toronto. Such a charming girl. You'd have loved meeting her, Doss. I think Mrs. Bartlett did send you a card. Perhaps you'll drop in later on. No, I don't think so, said Valancy indifferently. I'll have to be home to get Barney's supper. We're going for a moonlit canoe ride around Mistawey's tonight. Barney? Supper? Gasped Olive. What do you mean, Valancy Stirling? Valancy Snaith, by the grace of God. Valancy flaunted her wedding ring in Olive's stricken face. Then she nimbly stepped past her and into the house. Cousin Georgiana followed. She would not miss a moment of the great scene, even though Olive did look as if she were going to faint. Olive did not faint. She went stupidly down the street to Mrs. Bartlett's. What did Doss mean? She couldn't have that ring. Oh, what fresh scandal was that wretched girl bringing on her defenseless family now? She should have been shut up long ago. Valancy opened the sitting room door and stepped unexpectedly right into a grim assemblage of Stirlings. They had not come together of malice prepense. Aunt Wellington and Cousin Gladys and Aunt Mildred and Cousin Sarah had just called in on their way home from a meeting of the Missionary Society. Uncle James had dropped in to give Amelia some information regarding a doubtful investment. Uncle Benjamin had called, apparently, to tell them it was a hot day and ask them what was the difference between a bee and a donkey. Cousin Stickles had been tactless enough to know the answer. One gets all the honey, the other all the wax. And Uncle Benjamin was in a bad humor. In all of their minds, unexpressed, was the idea of finding out if Valancy had yet come home, and if not, what steps must be taken in the matter. Well, here was Valancy at last, a poised, confident thing, not humble and deprecating as she should have been, and so oddly, improperly young-looking. She stood in the doorway and looked at them, Cousin Georgiana timorous, expectant, behind her. Valancy was so happy she didn't hate her people anymore. She could even see a number of good qualities in them that she had never seen before, and she was sorry for them. Her pity made her quite gentle. "Well, Mother," she said pleasantly. "So you've come home at last," said Mrs. Frederick, getting out a handkerchief. She dared not be outraged, but she did not mean to be cheated of her tears. "Well, not exactly," said Valancy. She threw her bomb. "I thought I ought to drop in and tell you I was married, last Tuesday night, to Barney Snaith." Uncle Benjamin bounced up and sat down again. "God bless my soul," he said dully. The rest seemed turned to stone, except Cousin Gladys, who turned faint. Aunt Mildred and Uncle Wellington had to help her out to the kitchen. "She would have to keep up the Victorian traditions," said Valancy with a grin. She sat down, uninvited, on a chair. Cousin Stickles had begun to sob. "Is there one day in your life that you haven't cried?" asked Valancy curiously. "Valancy," said Uncle James, being the first to recover the power of utterance, "did you mean what you said just now?" "I did." "Do you mean to say that you have actually gone and married that notorious Barney Snaith, that criminal, that—" "I have." "Then," said Uncle James violently, "you are a shameless creature, lost to all sense of propriety and virtue, and I wash my hands entirely of you. I do not want ever to see your face again." "What have you left to say when I commit murder?" asked Valancy. Uncle Benjamin again appealed to God to bless his soul. "That drunken outlaw, that—" A dangerous spark appeared in Valancy's eyes. They might say what they liked to and of her, but they should not abuse Barney. "Say damn, and you'll feel better," she suggested. "I can express my feelings without blasphemy, and I tell you have covered yourself with eternal disgrace and infamy by marrying that drunkard. You would be more endurable if you got drunk occasionally. Barney is not a drunkard. He was seen drunk in Port Lawrence, pickled to the gills," said Uncle Benjamin. "If that is true, and I don't believe it, he had a good reason for it. Now I suggest that you all stop looking tragic and accept the situation. I'm married, you can't undo that, and I'm perfectly happy." "I suppose we ought to be thankful he has really married her," said Cousin Sarah, by way of trying to look on the bright side. "If he really has," said Uncle James, who had just washed his hands of Valancy. "Who married you?" "Mr. Towers, of Port Lawrence." "By a Free Methodist," groaned Mrs. Frederick, as if to have been married by an imprisoned Methodist would have been a shade less disgraceful. It was the first thing she had said. Mrs. Frederick didn't know what to say. The whole thing was too horrible, too nightmarish. She was sure she must wake up soon. After all their bright hopes at the funeral. "It makes me think of those what-ye-call-em-us," said Uncle Benjamin helplessly. "Those yarns, you know, of fairies taking babies out of their cradles." "Valancy could hardly be a changeling at 29, said Aunt Wellington satirically. "She was the oddest-looking baby I ever saw anyway," averred Uncle Benjamin. "I said so at the time. You remember, Amelia? I said I had never seen such eyes in a human head." "I'm glad I never had any children," said Cousin Sarah. "If they don't break your heart in one way, they do it in another." "Isn't it better to have your heart broken than to have it wither up?" queried Valancy. "Before it could be broken, it must have felt something splendid. That would be worth the pain." "Dippy, clean dippy," muttered Uncle Benjamin, with a vague, unsatisfactory feeling that somebody had said something like that before. "Valancy," said Mrs. Frederick solemnly, "do you ever pray to be forgiven for disobeying your mother?" "I should pray to be forgiven for obeying you so long," said Valancy stubbornly. "But I don't pray about that at all. I just thank God every day for my happiness." "I would rather," said Mrs. Frederick, beginning to cry rather belatedly, "see you dead before me than listen to what you have told me today." Valancy looked at her mother and aunts and wondered if they could ever have known anything of the real meaning of love. She felt sorrier for them than ever. They were so very pitiable, and they never suspected it. "Barney Snaith is a scoundrel to have deluded you into marrying him," said Uncle James violently. "Oh, I did the deluding. I asked him to marry me," said Valancy with a wicked smile. "Have you no pride?" demanded Aunt Wellington. "Lots of it. I am proud that I have achieved a husband by my own unaided efforts. Cousin Georgiana here wanted to help me to Edward Beck. Edward Beck is worth $20,000 and has the finest house between here and Port Lawrence," said Uncle Benjamin. "That sounds very fine," said Valancy scornfully, "but it isn't worth that." She snapped her fingers, compared to feeling Barney's arms around me and his cheek against mine. "Oh, Doss," said Cousin Stickles. Cousin Sarah said, "Oh, Doss." Aunt Wellington said, "Valancy, you need not be indecent." "Why, it surely isn't indecent to like to have your husband put his arm around you. I should think it would be indecent if you didn't." "Why expect decency from her?" inquired Uncle James sarcastically. "She has cut herself off from decency forevermore. She has made her bed. Let her lie on it." "Thanks," said Valancy very gratefully. "How you would have enjoyed being Torquemada. Now, I must really be getting back. Mother, may I have those 3 woolen cushions I worked last winter?" "Take them, take everything," said Mrs. Frederick. "Oh, I don't want everything, or much. I don't want my blue castle cluttered. Just the cushions. I'll call for them some day when we motor in." Valancy rose and went to the door. There she turned. She was sorrier than ever for them all. They had no blue castle in the purple solitudes of Mistawis. "The trouble with you people is that you don't laugh enough," she said. "Doss, dear," said Cousin Georgiana mournfully, "some day you will discover that blood is thicker than water." "Of course it is. But who wants water to be thick?" parried Valancy. "We want water to be thin, sparkling, crystal clear." Cousin Stickles groaned. Valancy would not ask any of them to come and see her. She was afraid they would come out of curiosity. But she said, "Do you mind if I drop in and see you once in a while, Mother?" "My house will always be open to you," said Mrs. Frederick, with a mournful dignity. "You should never recognize her again," said Uncle James sternly, as the door closed behind Valancy. "I cannot quite forget that I am a mother," said Mrs. Frederick. "My poor, unfortunate girl." "I dare say the marriage isn't legal," said Uncle James comfortingly. "He has probably been married half a dozen times before. But I am through with her. I have done all I could. Amelia, I think you will admit that." Henceforth, Uncle James was terribly solemn about it. "Valancy is to me as one dead." "Mrs. Barney Snaith," said Cousin Georgiana, as if trying it out to see how it would sound. He has a score of aliases, no doubt, said Uncle Benjamin. For my part, I believe the man is half Indian. I haven't a doubt they're living in a wigwam. If he has married her under the name of Snaith, and it isn't his real name, wouldn't that make the marriage null and void? Asked Cousin Stickles hopefully. Uncle James shook his head. No, it is the man who marries, not the name. You know, said Cousin Gladys, who had recovered and returned but was still shaky, I had a distinct premonition of this at Herbert's silver dinner. I remarked it at the time, when she was defending Snaith. You remember, of course. It came over me like a revelation. I spoke to David when I went home about it. What? Demanded Aunt Wellington of the universe. Has come over Valancy. Valancy. The universe did not answer, but Uncle James did. Isn't there something coming up of late about secondary personalities cropping out? I don't hold with many of those newfangled notions, but there may be something in this one. It would account for her incomprehensible conduct. Valancy is so fond of mushrooms, sighed Cousin Georgiana. I'm afraid she'll get poisoned eating toadstools by mistake living up back in the woods. There are worse things than death, said Uncle James, believing that it was the first time in the world that such a statement had been made. Nothing can ever be the same again, sobbed Cousin Stickles. Valancy, hurrying along the dusty road, back to cool Mastawis and her purple island, had forgotten all about them, just as she had forgotten that she might drop dead at any moment if she hurried. Chapter 28. Summer passed by. The Stirling clan, with the insignificant exception of Cousin Georgiana, had tacitly agreed to follow Uncle James' example and look upon Valancy as one dead. To be sure, Valancy had an unquiet, ghostly habit of recurring resurrections when she and Barney clattered through Deerwood and out to the port in that unspeakable car. Valancy, bareheaded, with stars in her eyes. Barney, bareheaded, smoking his pipe, but shaved. Always shaved now, if any of them had noticed it. They even had the audacity to go into Uncle Benjamin's store to buy groceries. Twice Uncle Benjamin ignored them. Was not Valancy one of the dead? While Snaith had never existed. But the third time he told Barney he was a scoundrel who should be hung for luring an unfortunate, weak-minded girl away from her home and friends. Barney's one straight eyebrow went up. I have made her happy, he said coolly, and she was miserable with her friends. So that's that. Uncle Benjamin stared. It had never occurred to him that women had to be, or ought to be, made happy. You pup, he said. Why be so unoriginal? Queried Barney amiably. Anybody could call me a pup. Why not think of something worthy of the Stirlings? Besides, I'm not a pup. I'm really quite a middle-aged dog. 35, if you're interested in knowing. Uncle Benjamin remembered just in time that Valancy was dead. He turned his back on Barney. Valancy was happy, gloriously and entirely so. She seemed to be living in a wonderful house of life, and every day opened a new, mysterious room. It was in a world which had nothing in common with the one she had left behind. A world where time was not, which was young with immortal youth, where there was neither past nor future but only the present. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of it. The absolute freedom of it all was unbelievable. They could do exactly as they liked. No Mrs. Grundy, no traditions, no relatives, or in-laws. Peace, perfect peace, with loved ones far away, as Barney quoted shamelessly. Valancy had gone home once and got her cushions, and Cousin Georgiana had given her one of her famous candlewick spreads of most elaborate design. For your spare room bed, dear, she said. But I haven't got any spare room, said Valancy. Cousin Georgiana looked horrified. A house without a spare room was monstrous to her. But it's a lovely spread, said Valancy with a kiss, and I'm so glad to have it. I'll put it on my own bed. Barney's old patchwork quilt is getting ragged. I don't see how you can be contented to live up back, sighed Cousin Georgiana. It's so out of the world. Contented. Valancy laughed. What was the use of trying to explain to Cousin Georgiana? It is, she agreed, most gloriously and entirely out of the world. And you are really happy, dear? Asked Cousin Georgiana wistfully. I really am, said Valancy gravely, her eyes dancing. Marriage is such a serious thing, sighed Cousin Georgiana. When it's going to last long, agreed Valancy. Cousin Georgiana did not understand this at all, but it worried her, and she lay awake at nights wondering what Valancy meant by it. Valancy loved her blue castle and was completely satisfied with it. The big living room had 3 windows, all commanding exquisite views of exquisite Mistawis. The one in the end of the room was an oriel window, which Tom McMurray, Barney explained, had got out of some little, old up-back church that had been sold. It faced the west, and when the sunsets flooded it, Valancy's whole being knelt in prayer, as if in some great cathedral. The new moons always looked down through it, the lower pine boughs swayed about the top of it, and all through the nights the soft, dim silver of the lake dreamed through it. There was a stone fireplace on the other side. No desecrating gas imitation, but a real fireplace where you could burn real logs, with a big grizzly bearskin on the floor before it, and beside it a hideous, red plush sofa of Tom McMurray's regime. But its ugliness was hidden by silver-gray timber wolf skins, and Valancy's cushions made it gay and comfortable. In a corner a nice, tall, lazy old clock ticked, the right kind of a clock, one that did not hurry the hours away but ticked them off deliberately. It was the jolliest-looking old clock, a fat, corpulent clock with a great, round, man's face painted on it, the hands stretching out of its nose and the hours encircling it like a halo. There was a big glass case of stuffed owls and several deer heads, likewise of Tom McMurray's vintage. Some comfortable old chairs that asked to be sat upon. A squat little chair with a cushion was prescriptively Banjo's. If anybody else dared sit on it, Banjo glared him out of it with his topaz-hued, black-ringed eyes. Banjo had an adorable habit of hanging over the back of it, trying to catch his own tail, losing his temper because he couldn't catch it, giving it a fierce bite for spite when he did catch it, yowling malignantly with pain. Barney and Valancy laughed at him until they ached, but it was Good Luck they loved. They were both agreed that Good Luck was so lovable that he practically amounted to an obsession. One side of the wall was lined with rough, homemade bookshelves filled with books, and between the 2 side windows hung an old mirror in a faded gilt frame, with fat cupids gambling in the panel over the glass. A mirror, Valancy thought, that must be like the fabled mirror into which Venus had once looked, and which thereafter reflected as beautiful every woman who looked into it. Valancy thought she was almost pretty in that mirror, but that may have been because she had shingled her hair. This was before the day of bobs and was regarded as a wild, unheard-of proceeding, unless you had typhoid. When Mrs. Frederick heard of it, she almost decided to erase Valancy's name from the family Bible. Barney cut the hair, square off at the back of Valancy's neck, bringing it down in a short black fringe over her forehead. It gave a meaning and a purpose to her little, 3-cornered face that it never had possessed before. Even her nose ceased to irritate her. Her eyes were bright, and her sallow skin had cleared to the hue of creamy ivory. The old family joke had come true. She was really fat at last. Anyway, no longer skinny. Valancy might never be beautiful, but she was of the type that looks its best in the woods. Elfin, mocking, alluring. Her heart bothered her very little. When an attack threatened, she was generally able to head it off with Dr. Trent's prescription. The only bad one she had was one night when she was temporarily out of medicine. And it was a bad one. For the time being, Valancy realized keenly that death was actually waiting to pounce on her any moment. But the rest of the time she did not, let herself remember it at all. Chapter 29. Valancy toiled not, neither did she spin. There was really very little work to do. She cooked their meals on a coal-oil stove, performing all her little domestic rites carefully and exultingly, and they ate out on the veranda that almost overhung the lake. Before them lay Mistawis, like a scene out of some fairy tale of old time, and Barney smiling his twisted, enigmatical smile at her across the table. What a view old Tom picked out when he built this shack, Barney would say exultantly. Supper was the meal Valancy liked best. The faint laughter of winds was always about them, and the colors of Mistawis, imperial and spiritual, under the changing clouds were something that cannot be expressed in mere words. Shadows, too, clustering in the pines until a wind shook them out and pursued them over Mistawis. They lay all day along the shores, threaded by ferns and wild blossoms. They stole around the headlands in the glow of the sunset, until twilight wove them all into one great web of dusk. The cats, with their wise, innocent little faces, would sit on the veranda railing and eat the tidbits Barney flung them. And how good everything tasted! Valancy, amid all the romance of Mistawis, never forgot that men had stomachs. Barney paid her no end of compliments on her cooking. After all, he admitted, there's something to be said for square meals. I've mostly got along by boiling 2 or 3 dozen eggs hard at once and eating a few when I got hungry, with a slice of bacon once in a while and a jorum of tea. Valancy poured tea out of Barney's little battered old pewter teapot of incredible age. She had not even a set of dishes, only Barney's mismatched chipped bits and a dear, big, pobby old jug of robin's egg blue. After the meal was over, they would sit there and talk for hours, or sit and say nothing, in all the languages of the world, Barney pulling away at his pipe, Valancy dreaming idly and deliciously, gazing at the far-off hills beyond Mistawis where the spires of firs came out against the sunset. The moonlight would begin to silver the Mistawis' dusk. Bats would begin to swoop darkly against the pale, western gold. The little waterfall that came down on the high bank not far away would, by some whim of the wildwood gods, begin to look like a wonderful white woman beckoning through the spicy, fragrant evergreens. And Leander would begin to chuckle diabolically on the mainland shore. How sweet it was to sit there and do nothing in the beautiful silence, with Barney at the other side of the table, smoking. There were plenty of other islands in sight, though none were near enough to be troublesome as neighbors. There was one little group of islets far off to the west which they called the Fortunate Isles. At sunrise they looked like a cluster of emeralds, at sunset like a cluster of amethysts. They were too small for houses, but the lights on the larger islands would bloom out all over the lake, and bonfires would be lighted on their shores, streaming up into the wood shadows and throwing great, blood-red ribbons over the waters. Music would drift to them alluringly from boats here and there, or from the verandas on the big house of the millionaire on the biggest island. "Would you like a house like that, Moonlight?" Barney asked once, waving his hand at it. He had taken to calling her Moonlight, and Valancy loved it. "No," said Valancy, who had once dreamed of a mountain castle 10 times the size of the rich man's cottage, and now pitied the poor inhabitants of palaces. "No, it's too elegant. I would have to carry it with me everywhere I went, on my back like a snail. It would own me, possess me, body and soul. I like a house I can love and cuddle and boss, just like ours here. I don't envy Hamilton Gossard, the finest summer residence in Canada. It is magnificent, but it isn't my blue castle." Away down at the far end of the lake, they got every night a glimpse of a big, continental train rushing through a clearing. Valancy liked to watch its lighted windows flash by and wonder who was on it and what hopes and fears it carried. She also amused herself by picturing Barney and herself going to the dances and dinners in the houses on the islands, but she did not want to go in reality. Once they did go to a masquerade dance in the pavilion at one of the hotels up the lake and had a glorious evening, but slipped away in their canoe, before unmasking time, back to the Blue Castle. "It was lovely, but I don't want to go again," said Valancy. So many hours a day Barney shut himself up in Bluebeard's chamber. Valancy never saw the inside of it. From the smells that filtered through at times, she concluded he must be conducting chemical experiments, or counterfeiting money. Valancy supposed there must be smelly processes in making counterfeit money, but she did not trouble herself about it. She had no desire to peer into the locked chambers of Barney's house of life. His past and his future concerned her not. Only this rapturous present. Nothing else mattered. Once he went away, and stayed away 2 days and nights. He had asked Valancy if she would be afraid to stay alone, and she had said she would not. He never told her where he had been. She was not afraid to be alone, but she was horribly lonely. The sweetest sound she had ever heard was Lady Jane's clatter through the woods when Barney returned, and then his signal whistle from the shore. She ran down to the landing rock to greet him, to nestle herself into his eager arms. They did seem eager. "Have you missed me, Moonlight?" Barney was whispering. "It seems 100 years since you went away," said Valancy. "I won't leave you again." "You must," protested Valancy, "if you want to. I'd be miserable if I thought you wanted to go and didn't." Because of me. I want you to feel perfectly free." Barney laughed, a little cynically. "There is no such thing as freedom on earth," he said. "Only different kinds of bondages. And comparative bondages. You think you are free now because you've escaped from a peculiarly unbearable kind of bondage. But are you? You love me, that's a bondage. Who said or wrote that the prison unto which we doom ourselves no prison is?" asked Valancy dreamily, clinging to his arm as they climbed up the rock steps. "Ah, now you have it," said Barney. "That's all the freedom we can hope for, the freedom to choose our prison." But, moonlight, he stopped at the door of the blue castle and looked about him. At the glorious lake, the great, shadowy woods, the bonfires, the twinkling lights. Moonlight. "I'm glad to be home again. When I came down through the woods and saw my home lights, mine, gleaming out under the old pines, something I'd never seen before. Oh, girl, I was glad, glad." But in spite of Barney's doctrine of bondage, Valancy thought they were splendidly free. It was amazing to be able to sit up half the night and look at the moon if you wanted to be late for meals if you wanted to. She who had always been rebuked so sharply by her mother and so reproachfully by Cousin Stickles if she were 1 minute late. Dawdle over meals as long as you wanted to. Leave your crusts if you wanted to. Not come home at all for meals if you wanted to. Sit on a sun-warm rock and paddle your bare feet in the hot sand if you wanted to. Just sit and do nothing in the beautiful silence if you wanted to. In short, do any fool thing you wanted to whenever the notion took you. If that wasn't freedom, what was? Chapter 30. They didn't spend all their days on the island. They spent more than half of them wandering at will through the enchanted Muskoka country. Barney knew the woods as a book, and he taught their lore and craft to Valancy. He could always find trail and haunt of the shywood people. Valancy learned the different fairy likenesses of the mosses, the charm and exquisiteness of woodland blossoms. She learned to know every bird at sight and mimic its call, though never so perfectly as Barney. She made friends with every kind of tree. She learned to paddle a canoe as well as Barney himself. She liked to be out in the rain, and she never caught cold. Sometimes they took a lunch with him and went berrying, strawberries and blueberries. How pretty blueberries were! The dainty green of the unripe berries, the glossy pinks and scarlets of the half-ripes, the misty blue of the fully matured. And Valancy learned the real flavor of the strawberry in its highest perfection. There was a certain sunlit dell on the banks of Mistawis, along which white birches grew on one side, and on the other still, changeless ranks of young spruces. There were long grasses at the roots of the birches, combed down by the winds and wet with morning dew late into the afternoons. Here they found berries that might have graced the banquets of Lucullus, great ambrosial sweetnesses hanging like rubies to long, rosy stalks. They lifted them by the stalk and ate them from it, uncrushed and virgin, tasting each berry by itself with all its wild fragrance ensphered therein. When Valancy carried any of these berries home, that elusive essence escaped, and they became nothing more than the common berries of the marketplace. Very kitchenly good indeed, but not as they would have been, eaten in their birch dell until her fingers were stained as pink as Aurora's eyelids. Or they went after water lilies. Barney knew where to find them in the creeks and bays of Mistawis. Then the blue castle was glorious with them. Every receptacle that Valancy could contrive filled with the exquisite things. If not water lilies, then cardinal flowers, fresh and vivid from the swamps of Mistawis, where they burned like ribbons of flame. Sometimes they went truding on little nameless rivers or hidden brooks on whose banks naiads might have sunned their white, wet limbs. Then all they took with them were some raw potatoes and salt. They roasted the potatoes over a fire, and Barney showed Valancy how to cook the trout by wrapping them in leaves, coating them with mud, and baking them in a bed of hot coals. Never were such delicious meals. Valancy had such an appetite, it was no wonder she put flesh on her bones. Or they just prowled and explored through woods that always seemed to be expecting something wonderful to happen. At least, that was the way Valancy felt about them. Down the next hollow, over the next hill, you would find it. We don't know where we're going, but isn't it fun to go? Barney used to say. Once or twice night overtook them, too far from their blue castle to get back. But Barney made a fragrant bed of bracken and fir boughs, and they slept on it dreamlessly, under a ceiling of old spruces with moss hanging from them, while beyond the moonlight and the murmur of pines blended together so that one could hardly tell which was light and which was sound. There were rainy days, of course, when Muskoka was a wet green land. Days when showers drifted across Mistawis like pale ghosts of rain, and they never thought of staying in because of it. Days when it rained in right good earnest, and they had to stay in. Then Barney shut himself up in Bluebeard's chamber and Valancy read, or dreamed on the wolfskins with Good Luck, purring beside her and Banjo watching them suspiciously from his own peculiar chair. On Sunday evenings they paddled across to a point of land and walked from there through the woods to the little Free Methodist church. One felt really too happy for Sunday. Valancy had never really liked Sundays before. And always, Sundays and weekdays, she was with Barney. Nothing else really mattered. And what a companion he was. How understanding. How jolly. How Barney-like. That summed it all up. Valancy had taken some of her $200 out of the bank and spent it in pretty clothes. She had a little smoke blue chiffon which she always put on when they spent the evening at home. Smoke blue with touches of silver about it. It was after she began wearing it that Barney began calling her Moonlight. Moonlight and blue twilight, that is what you look like in that dress. I like it. It belongs to you. You aren't exactly pretty, but you have some adorable beauty spots. Your eyes. And that little kissable dent just between your collarbones. You have the wrist and ankle of an aristocrat. That little head of yours is beautifully shaped. And when you look backward over your shoulder, you're maddening, especially in twilight or moonlight. An elf maiden, a wood sprite. You belong to the woods, Moonlight. You should never be out of them. In spite of your ancestry, there is something wild and remote and untamed about you. And you have such a nice, sweet, throaty, summery voice. Such a nice voice for lovemaking. Sure, and Yve kissed the Blarney Stone, scoffed Valancy. But she tasted these compliments for weeks. She got a pale green bathing suit, too, a garment which would have given her clan their deaths if they had ever seen her in it. Barney taught her how to swim. Sometimes she put her bathing dress on when she got up and didn't take it off until she went to bed, running down to the water for a plunge whenever she felt like it and sprawling on the sun-warm rocks to dry. She had forgotten all the old humiliating things that used to come up against her in the night, the injustices and the disappointments. It was as if they had all happened to some other person, not to her, Valancy Snaith, who had always been happy. I understand now what it means to be born again, she told Barney. Holmes speaks of grief, staining backward through the pages of life. But Valancy found her happiness had stained backward likewise and flooded with rose color her whole previous drab existence. She found it hard to believe that she had ever been lonely and unhappy and afraid. When death comes, I shall have lived, thought Valancy. I shall have had my hour. And her dust pile. One day Valancy had heaped up the sand in the little island cove in a tremendous cone and stuck a gay little Union Jack on top of it. What are you celebrating? Barney wanted to know. I'm just exorcising an old demon, Valancy told him. Chapter 31. Autumn came, late September with cool nights. They had to forsake the veranda, but they kindled a fire in the big fireplace and sat before it with jest and laughter. They left the doors open, and Banjo and Good Luck came and went at pleasure. Sometimes they sat gravely on the bearskin rug between Barney and Valancy. Sometimes they slunk off into the mystery of the chill night outside. The stars smoldered in the horizon mists through the old oriole. The haunting, persistent croon of the pine trees filled the air. The little waves began to make soft, sobbing splashes on the rocks below them in the rising winds. They needed no light but the firelight that sometimes leaped up and revealed them, sometimes shrouded them in shadow. When the night wind rose higher, Barney would shut the door and light a lamp and read to her poetry and essays and gorgeous, dim chronicles of ancient wars. Barney never would read novels. He vowed they bored him. But sometimes she read them herself, curled up on the wolf skins, laughing aloud in peace. For Barney was not one of those aggravating people who can never hear you smiling audibly over something you've read without inquiring placidly, "What is the joke?" October, with a gorgeous pageant of color around Mistawis, into which Valancy plunged her soul. Never had she imagined anything so splendid. A great, tinted peace. Blue, wind-winnowed skies. Sunlight sleeping in the glades of that fairyland. Long, dreamy purple days paddling idly in their canoe along shores and up the rivers of crimson and gold. A sleepy, red hunter's moon. Enchanted tempests that stripped the leaves from the trees and heaped them along the shores. Flying shadows of clouds. What had all the smug, opulent lands out front to compare with this? November, with uncanny witchery in its changed trees. With murky red sunsets flaming in smoky crimson behind the westering hills. With dear days when the austere woods were beautiful and gracious in a dignified serenity of folded hands and closed eyes. Days full of a fine, pale sunshine that sifted through the late, leafless gold of the juniper trees and glimmered among the gray beaches, lighting up evergreen banks of moss and washing the colonnades of the pines. Days with a high-sprung sky of flawless turquoise. Days when an exquisite melancholy seemed to hang over the landscape and dream about the lake. But days, too, of the wild blackness of great autumn storms, followed by dank, wet, streaming nights when there was witch laughter in the pines and fitful moans among the mainland trees. What cared they? Old Tom had built his roof well, and his chimney drew warm fire, books, comfort, safety from storm, our cats on the rug. Moonlight, said Barney. Would you be any happier now if you had $1 million? No, nor half so happy. I'd be bored by conventions and obligations then. December. Early snows and Orion. The pale fires of the Milky Way. It was really winter now. Wonderful, cold, starry winter. How Valancy had always hated winter. Dull, brief, uneventful days. Long, cold, companionless nights. Cousin Stickles with her back that had to be rubbed continually. Cousin Stickles making weird noises gargling her throat in the mornings. Cousin Stickles whining over the price of coal. Her mother, probing, questioning, ignoring. Endless colds and bronchitis, or the dread of it. Redfern's liniment and purple pills. But now she loved winter. Winter was beautiful up back, almost intolerably beautiful. Days of clear brilliance. Evenings that were like cups of glamour, the purest vintage of winter's wine. Nights with their fire of stars. Cold, exquisite winter sunrises. Lovely ferns of ice all over the windows of the blue castle. Moonlight on birches in a silver thaw. Ragged shadows on windy evenings. Torn, twisted, fantastic shadows. Great silences, austere and searching. Jeweled, barbaric hills. The sun suddenly breaking through gray clouds over long, white Mistawis. Icy gray twilights, broken by snow squalls, when their cozy living room, with its goblins of firelight and inscrutable cats, seemed cozier than ever. Every hour brought a new revelation and wonder. Barney ran Lady Jane into Roaring Abel's barn and taught Valancy how to snowshoe. Valancy, who ought to be laid up with bronchitis. But Valancy had not even a cold. Later on in the winter Barney had a terrible one and Valancy nursed him through it with a dread of pneumonia in her heart. But Valancy's colds seemed to have gone where old moons go, which was luck, for she hadn't even Redfern's liniment. She had thoughtfully bought a bottle at the port and Barney had hurled it into frozen Mistawis with a scowl. "Bring no more of that devilish stuff here," he had ordered briefly. It was the first and last time he had spoken harshly to her. They went for long tramps through the exquisite reticence of winter woods and the silver jungles of frosted trees, and found loveliness everywhere. At times they seemed to be walking through a spellbound world of crystal and pearl, so white and radiant were clearings and lakes and sky. The air was so crisp and clear that it was half intoxicating. Once they stood in a hesitation of ecstasy at the entrance of a narrow path between ranks of birches. Every twig and spray was outlined in snow. The undergrowth along its sides was a little fairy forest cut out of marble. The shadows cast by the pale sunshine were fine and spiritual. "Come away," said Barney, turning. "We must not commit the desecration of tramping through there." One evening they came upon a snowdrift far back in an old clearing which was in the exact likeness of a beautiful woman's profile. Seen too close by, the resemblance was lost, as in the fairy tale of the castle of St. John. Seen from behind, it was a shapeless oddity. But at just the right distance and angle the outline was so perfect that when they came suddenly upon it, gleaming out against the dark background of spruce in the glow of that winter sunset, they both exclaimed in amazement. There was a low, noble brow, a straight, classic nose, lips and chin and cheek curve modeled as if some goddess of old time had sat to the sculptor, and a breast of such cold, swelling purity as the very spirit of the winter woods might display. All the beauty that old Greece and Rome, sung painted, taught, quoted Barney. And to think no human eyes save ours have seen or will see it, breathed Valancy, who felt at times as if she were living in a book by John Foster. As she looked around her, she recalled some passages she had marked in the new Foster book Barney had brought her from the port, with an adjuration not to expect him to read or listen to it. All the tintings of winter woods are extremely delicate and elusive, recalled Valancy. When the brief afternoon wanes and the sun just touches the tops of the hills, there seems to be all over the woods an abundance, not of color, but of the spirit of color. There is really nothing but pure white after all, but one has the impression of fairy-like blendings of rose and violet, opal and heliotrope on the slopes, in the dingles and along the curves of the forest land. You feel sure the tint is there, but when you look at it directly it is gone. From the corner of your eye you are aware that it is lurking over yonder in a spot where there was nothing but pale purity a moment ago. Only just when the sun is setting is there a fleeting moment of real color. Then the redness streams out over the snow and incarnadines the hills and rivers and smites the crest of the pines with flame. Just a few minutes of transfiguration and revelation, and it is gone. I wonder if John Foster ever spent a winter in Mistawis, said Valancy. Not likely, scoffed Barney. People who write tosh like that generally write it in a warm house on some smug city street. You are too hard on John Foster, said Valancy severely. No one could have written that little paragraph I read you last night without having seen it first. You know he couldn't. I didn't listen to it, said Barney morosely. You know I told you I wouldn't. Then you've got to listen to it now, persisted Valancy. She made him stand still on his snowshoes while she repeated it. She is a rare artist, this old Mother Nature, who works for the joy of working and not in any spirit of vain show. Today the fir woods are a symphony of greens and grays, so subtle that you cannot tell where one shade begins to be the other. Gray trunk, green bough, gray-green moss above the white, gray-shadowed floor. Yet the old gypsy doesn't like unrelieved monotones. She must have a dash of color. See it, a broken dead fir bough, of a beautiful red-brown, swinging among the beards of moss. Good Lord, do you learn all that fellow's books by heart? Was Barney's disgusted reaction as he strode off. John Foster's books were all that saved my soul alive the past 5 years, averred Valancy. Oh, Barney, look at that exquisite filigree of snow in the furrows of that old elm tree trunk. When they came out to the lake, they changed from snowshoes to skates and skated home. For a wonder Valancy had learned, when she was a little schoolgirl, to skate on the pond behind the Deerwood school. She never had any skates of her own, but some of the other girls had lent her theirs, and she seemed to have a natural knack of it. Uncle Benjamin had once promised her a pair of skates for Christmas, but when Christmas came he had given her rubbers instead. She had never skated since she grew up, but the old trick came back quickly, and glorious were the hours she and Barney spent skimming over the white lakes and past the dark islands where the summer cottages were closed and silent. Tonight they flew down Mistawis before the wind, in an exhilaration that crimsoned Valancy's cheeks under her white tam. And at the end was her dear little house, on the island of pines, with a coating of snow on its roof, sparkling in the moonlight. Its windows glinted impishly at her in the stay gleams. Looks exactly like a picture book, doesn't it? Said Barney. They had a lovely Christmas. No rush, no scramble, no niggling attempts to make ends meet. No wild effort to remember whether she hadn't given the same kind of present to the same person 2 Christmases before. No mob of last-minute shoppers. No dreary family reunions where she sat mute and unimportant. No attacks of nerves. They decorated the blue castle with pine boughs, and Valancy made delightful little tinsel stars and hung them up amid the greenery. She cooked a dinner to which Barney did full justice, while Good Luck and Banjo picked the bones. A land that can produce a goose like that is an admirable land, vowed Barney. Canada forever. And they drank to the Union Jack a bottle of dandelion wine that Cousin Georgiana had given Valancy along with the bedspread. One never knows, Cousin Georgiana had said solemnly, when one may need a little stimulant. Barney had asked Valancy what she wanted for a Christmas present. Something frivolous and unnecessary, said Valancy, who had got a pair of galoshes last Christmas and two long-sleeved, woolen undervests the year before, and so on back. To her delight, Barney gave her a necklace of pearl beads. Valancy had wanted a string of milky pearl beads, like congealed moonshine, all her life. And these were so pretty. All that worried her was that they were really too good. They must have cost a great deal, $15 at least. Could Barney afford that? She didn't know a thing about his finances. She had refused to let him buy any of her clothes. She had enough for that, she told him, as long as she would need clothes. In a round, black jar on the chimney-piece Barney put money for their household expenses. Always enough. The jar was never empty, though Valancy never caught him replenishing it. He couldn't have much, of course, and that necklace, but Valancy tossed care aside. She would wear it and enjoy it. It was the first pretty thing she had ever had. Chapter 32. New Year. The old, shabby, inglorious outlive calendar came down. The new one went up. January was a month of storms. It snowed for 3 weeks on end. The thermometer went miles below zero and stayed there. But, as Barney and Valancy pointed out to each other, there were no mosquitoes, and the roar and crackle of their big fire drowned the howls of the north wind. Good Luck and Banjo waxed fat and developed resplendent coats of thick, silky fur. Nip and Tuck had gone. But they'll come back in spring, promised Barney. There was no monotony. Sometimes they had dramatic little private spats that never even thought of becoming quarrels. Sometimes Roaring Abel dropped in, for an evening or a whole day, with his old tartan cap and his long red beard coated with snow. He generally brought his fiddle and played for them, to the delight of all except Banjo, who would go temporarily insane and retreat under Valancy's bed. Sometimes Abel and Barney talked while Valancy made candy for them. Sometimes they sat and smoked in silence a la Tennyson and Carlyle, until the blue castle reeked and Valancy fled to the open. Sometimes they played checkers fiercely and silently the whole night through. Sometimes they all ate the russet apples Abel had brought, while the jolly old clock ticked the delightful minutes away. A plate of apples, an open fire, and a jolly good book whereon to look are a fair substitute for heaven, vowed Barney. Anyone can have the streets of gold. Let's have another whack at Carmen. It was easier now for the Stirlings to believe Valancy of the dead. Not even dim rumors of her having been over at the port came to trouble them, though she and Barney used to skate there occasionally to see a movie and eat hot dogs shamelessly at the corner stand afterwards. Presumably none of the Stirlings ever thought about her, except Cousin Georgiana, who used to lie awake worrying about poor Doss. Did she have enough to eat? Was that dreadful creature good to her? Was she warm enough at nights? Valancy was quite warm at nights. She used to wake up and revel silently in the coziness of those winter nights on that little island in the frozen lake. The nights of other winters had been so cold and long. Valancy hated to wake up in them and think about the bleakness and emptiness of the day that had passed and the bleakness and emptiness of the day that would come. Now, she almost counted that night lost on which she didn't wake up and lie awake for half an hour just being happy, while Barney's regular breathing went on beside her, and through the open door the smoldering brands in the fireplace winked at her in the gloom. It was very nice to feel a little lucky cat jump up on your bed in the darkness and snuggle down at your feet, purring. But Banjo would be sitting dourly by himself out in front of the fire like a brooding demon. At such moments Banjo was anything but canny, but Valancy loved his uncanniness. The side of the bed had to be right against the window. There was no other place for it in the tiny room. Valancy, lying there, could look out of the window, through the big pine boughs that actually touched it, away up Mistawey's, white and lustrous as a pavement of pearl, or dark and terrible in the storm. Sometimes the pine boughs tapped against the panes with friendly signals. Sometimes she heard the little hissing whisper of snow against them right at her side. Some nights the whole outer world seemed given over to the empery of silence. Then came nights when there would be a majestic sweep of wind in the pines. Nights of dear starlight when it whistled freakishly and joyously around the blue castle. Brooding nights before storm when it crept along the floor of the lake with a low, wailing cry of boding and mystery. Valancy wasted many perfectly good sleeping hours in these delightful communings. But she could sleep as long in the morning as she wanted to. Nobody cared. Barney cooked his own breakfast of bacon and eggs, and then shut himself up in Bluebeard's chamber till supper time. Then they had an evening of reading and talk. They talked about everything in this world and a good many things in other worlds. They laughed over their own jokes until the blue castles re-echoed. "You do laugh beautifully," Barney told her once. "It makes me want to laugh just to hear you laugh. There's a trick about your laugh, as if there were so much more fun back of it that you wouldn't let out. Did you laugh like that before you came to Miss Stowie's, Moonlight?" "I never laughed at all, really. I used to giggle foolishly when I felt I was expected to. But now, the laugh just comes." It struck Valancy more than once that Barney himself laughed a great deal oftener than he used to, and that his laugh had changed. It had become wholesome. She rarely heard the little cynical note in it now. Could a man laugh like that who had crimes on his conscience? Yet Barney must have done something. Valancy had indifferently made up her mind as to what he had done. She concluded he was a defaulting bank cashier. She had found in one of Barney's books an old clipping cut from a Montreal paper in which a vanished, defaulting cashier was described. The description applied to Barney, as well as to half a dozen other men Valancy knew, and from some casual remarks he had dropped from time to time she concluded he knew Montreal rather well. Valancy had it all figured out in the back of her mind. Barney had been in a bank. He was tempted to take some money to speculate, meaning, of course, to put it back. He had gotten deeper and deeper, until he found there was nothing for it but flight. It had happened so to scores of men. He had, Valancy was absolutely certain, never meant to do wrong. Of course, the name of the man in the clipping was Bernard Craig, but Valancy had always thought Snaith was an alias. Not that it mattered. Valancy had only one unhappy night that winter. It came in late March when most of the snow had gone and Nip and Tuck had returned. Barney had gone off in the afternoon for a long, woodland tramp, saying he would be back by dark if all went well. Soon after he had gone it had begun to snow. The wind rose and presently Miss Stowie's was in the grip of one of the worst storms of the winter. It tore up the lake and struck at the little house. The dark, angry woods on the mainland scowled at Valancy, menace in the toss of their boughs, threats in their windy gloom, terror in the roar of their hearts. The trees on the island crouched in fear. Valancy spent the night huddled on the rug before the fire, her face buried in her hands, when she was not vainly peering from the oriel in a futile effort to see through the furious smoke of wind and snow that had once been blue-dimpled Miss Stowie's. Where was Barney? Lost on the merciless lakes? Sinking exhausted in the drifts of the pathless woods? Valancy died 100 deaths that night and paid in full for all the happiness of her blue castle. When morning came the storm broke and cleared. The sun shone gloriously over Miss Stowie's, and at noon Barney came home. Valancy saw him from the oriel as he came around a wooded point, slender and black against the glistening white world. She did not run to meet him. Something happened to her knees, and she dropped down on Banjo's chair. Luckily Banjo got out from under in time, his whiskers bristling with indignation. Barney found her there, her head buried in her hands. "Barney, I thought you were dead," she whispered. Barney hooted. "After 2 years of the Klondike, did you think a baby storm like this could get me? I spent the night in that old lumber shanty over by Muskoka. A bit cold but snug enough. Little goose, your eyes look like burnt holes in a blanket. Did you sit up here all night worrying over an old woodsman like me?" "Yes," said Valancy. "I couldn't help it. The storm seemed so wild. Anybody might have been lost in it. When I saw you come round the point there, something happened to me. I don't know what. It was as if I had died and come back to life. I can't describe it any other way." Chapter 33. Spring. Miss Stowie's black and sullen for a week or two, then flaming in sapphire and turquoise, lilac and rose again, laughing through the oriel, caressing its amethyst islands, rippling under winds soft as silk, Frogs, little green wizards of swamp and pool, singing everywhere in the long twilights and long into the nights. Islands fairy-like in a green haze. The evanescent beauty of wild young trees in early leaf. Frost-like loveliness of the new foliage of juniper trees. The woods putting on a fashion of spring flowers, dainty, spiritual things akin to the soul of the wilderness. Red mist on the maples, willows decked out with glossy silver pussies. All the forgotten violets of Mistawis blooming. Again, lure of April moons. Think how many thousands of springs have been here on Mistawis, and all of them beautiful, said Valancy. Oh, Barney, look at that wild plum. I will. I must quote from John Foster. There's a passage in one of his books. I've reread it 100 times. He must have written it before a tree just like that. Behold the young wild plum tree which has adorned herself after immemorial fashion in a wedding veil of fine lace. The fingers of wood pixies must have woven it, for nothing like it ever came from an earthly loom. I vow the tree is conscious of its loveliness. It is bridling before our very eyes, as if its beauty were not the most ephemeral thing in the woods, as it is the rarest and most exceeding, for today it is and tomorrow it is not. Every south wind purring through the boughs will winnow away a shower of slender petals. But what matter? Today it is queen of the wild places, and it is always today in the woods. I'm sure you feel much better since you've got that out of your system, said Barney heartlessly. Here's a patch of dandelions, said Valancy, unsubdued. Dandelions shouldn't grow in the woods, though. They haven't any sense of the fitness of things at all. They are too cheerful and self-satisfied. They haven't any of the mystery and reserve of the real wood flowers. In short, they've no secrets, said Barney. But wait a bit. The woods will have their own way even with those obvious dandelions. In a little while all that obtrusive yellowness and complacency will be gone, and we'll find here misty, phantom-like globes hovering over those long grasses in full harmony with the traditions of the forest. That sounds John Fosterish, teased Valancy. What have I done that deserved a slam like that? Complained Barney. One of the earliest signs of spring was the renaissance of Lady Jane. Barney put her on roads that no other car would look at, and they went through Deerwood in mud to the axles. They passed several Stirlings, who groaned and reflected that now spring was come they would encounter that shameless pair everywhere. Valancy, prowling about Deerwood shops, met Uncle Benjamin on the street. But he did not realize until he had gone 2 blocks further on that the girl in the scarlet-collared blanket coat, with cheeks reddened in the sharp April air and the fringe of black hair over laughing, slanted eyes, was Valancy. When he did realize it, Uncle Benjamin was indignant. What business had Valancy to look like a young girl? The way of the transgressor was hard, had to be, scriptural and proper. Yet Valancy's path couldn't be hard. She wouldn't look like that if it were. There was something wrong. It was almost enough to make a man turn modernist. Barney and Valancy clanged on to the port, so that it was dark when they went through Deerwood again. At her old home Valancy, seized with a sudden impulse, got out, opened the little gate and tiptoed around to the sitting-room window. There sat her mother and Cousin Stickles drearily, grimly knitting, baffling and inhuman as ever. If they had looked the least bit lonesome, Valancy would have gone in. But they did not. Valancy would not disturb them for worlds. Chapter 34. Valancy had 2 wonderful moments that spring. One day, coming home through the woods, with her arms full of trailing arbutus and creeping spruce, she met a man who she knew must be Alan Tierney. Alan Tierney, the celebrated painter of beautiful women. He lived in New York in winter, but he owned an island cottage at the northern end of Mistawis, to which he always came the minute the ice was out of the lake. He was reputed to be a lonely, eccentric man. He never flattered his sitters. There was no need to, for he would not paint anyone who required flattery. To be painted by Alan Tierney was all the cachet of beauty a woman could desire. Valancy had heard so much about him that she couldn't help turning her head back over her shoulder for another shy, curious look at him. A shaft of pale spring sunlight fell through a great pine athwart her bare black head and her slanted eyes. She wore a pale green sweater and had bound a fillet of linnea vine about her hair. The feathery fountain of trailing spruce overflowed her arms and fell around her. Alan Tierney's eyes lighted up. "I've had a caller," said Barney the next afternoon, when Valancy had returned from another flower quest. "Who?" Valancy was surprised but indifferent. She began filling a basket with arbutus. "Alan Tierney. He wants to paint you, Moonlight." "Me?" Valancy dropped her basket and her arbutus. "You're laughing at me, Barney." "I'm not. That's what Tierney came for. To ask my permission to paint my wife as the spirit of Muskoka, or something like that." But, stammered Valancy, "Alan Tierney never paints any but beautiful women," finished Barney. Conceited. Q.E.D. Mistress Barney Snaith is a beautiful woman. "Nonsense," said Valancy, stooping to retrieve her arbutus. "You know that's nonsense, Barney. I know I'm a heap better looking than I was a year ago, but I'm not beautiful." "Alan Tierney never makes a mistake," said Barney. "You forget, Moonlight, that there are different kinds of beauty. Your imagination is obsessed by the very obvious type of your cousin Olive. Oh, I've seen her. She's a stunner. But you'd never catch Alan Tierney wanting to paint her. In the horrible but expressive slang phrase, she keeps all her goods in the shop window. But in your subconscious mind, you have a conviction that nobody can be beautiful who doesn't look like Olive. Also, you remember your face as it was in the days when your soul was not allowed to shine through it. Tierney said something about the curve of your cheek as you looked back over your shoulder. You know, I've often told you it was distracting, and he's quite batty about your eyes. If I wasn't absolutely sure it was solely professional, he's really a crabbed old bachelor, you know, I'd be jealous." "Well, I don't want to be painted," said Valancy. "I hope you told him that." "I couldn't tell him that. I didn't know what you wanted. But I told him I didn't want my wife painted, hung up in a salon for the mob to stare at, belonging to another man. For of course I couldn't buy the picture. So even if you had wanted to be painted, Moonlight, your tyrannous husband would not have permitted it." Tierney was a bit squiffy. He isn't used to being turned down like that. His requests are almost like royalties. "But we are outlaws," laughed Valancy. "We bow to no decrees. We acknowledge no sovereignty." In her heart she thought unashamedly, "I wish Olive could know that Alan Tierney wanted to paint me. Me, little old maid Valancy Stirling that was." Her second wonder moment came one evening in May. She realized that Barney actually liked her. She had always hoped he did, but sometimes she had a little, disagreeable, haunting dread that he was just kind and nice and chummy out of pity, knowing that she hadn't long to live and determined she should have a good time as long as she did live. But away back in his mind, rather looking forward to freedom again, with no intrusive woman creature in his island fastness and no chattering thing beside him in his woodland prowls. She knew he could never love her. She did not even want him to. If he loved her, he would be unhappy when she died. Valancy never flinched from the plain word. No passing away for her. And she did not want him to be the least unhappy. But neither did she want him to be glad or relieved. She wanted him to like her and miss her as a good chum. But she had never been sure until this night that he did. They had walked over the hills in the sunset. They had the delight of discovering a virgin spring in a ferny hollow and had drunk together from it out of a birch bark cup. They had come to an old tumble-down rail fence and sat on it for a long time. They didn't talk much, but Valancy had a curious sense of oneness. She knew that she couldn't have felt that if he hadn't liked her. "You nice little thing," said Barney suddenly. "Oh, you nice little thing. Sometimes I feel you're too nice to be real, that I'm just dreaming you. Why can't I die now, this very minute, when I am so happy?" thought Valancy. Well, it couldn't be so very long now. Somehow, Valancy had always felt she would live out the year Dr. Trent had allotted. She had not been careful. She had never tried to be. But, somehow, she had always counted on living out her year. She had not let herself think about it at all. But now, sitting here beside Barney, with her hand in his, a sudden realization came to her. She had not had a heart attack for a long while, 2 months at least. The last one she had had was 2 or 3 nights before Barney was out in the storm. Since then she had not remembered she had a heart. Well, no doubt, it betokened the nearness of the end. Nature had given up the struggle. There would be no more pain. "I'm afraid heaven will be very dull after this past year," thought Valancy. but perhaps one will not remember. Would that be nice? No, no. I don't want to forget Barney. I'd rather be miserable in heaven remembering him than happy forgetting him. And I'll always remember through all eternity that he really, really liked me. Chapter 35. 30 seconds can be very long sometimes. Long enough to work a miracle or a revolution. In 30 seconds, life changed wholly for Barney and Valancy Snaith. They had gone around the lake one June evening in their disappearing propeller, fished for an hour in a little creek, left their boat there, and walked up through the woods to Port Lawrence 2 miles away. Valancy prowled a bit in the shops and got herself a new pair of sensible shoes. Her old pair had suddenly and completely given out, and this evening she had been compelled to put on the little fancy pair of patent leather with rather high, slender heels, which she had bought in a fit of folly one day in the winter because of their beauty and because she wanted to make one foolish, extravagant purchase in her life. She sometimes put them on of an evening in the Blue Castle, but this was the first time she had worn them outside. She had not found it any too easy walking up through the woods in them, and Barney guyed her unmercifully about them. But in spite of the inconvenience, Valancy secretly rather liked the look of her trim ankles and high instep above those pretty, foolish shoes and did not change them in the shop as she might have done. The sun was hanging low above the pines when they left Port Lawrence. To the north of it, the woods closed around the town quite suddenly. Valancy always had a sense of stepping from one world to another, from reality to fairyland. When she went out of Port Lawrence and in a twinkling found it shut off behind her by the armies of the pines. A mile and a half from Port Lawrence there was a small railroad station with a little station house which at this hour of the day was deserted, since no local train was due. Not a soul was in sight when Barney and Valancy emerged from the woods. Off to the left a sudden curve in the track hid it from view, but over the treetops beyond, the long plume of smoke betokened the approach of a through train. The rails were vibrating to its thunder as Barney stepped across the switch. Valancy was a few steps behind him, loitering to gather June bells along the little, winding path. But there was plenty of time to get across before the train came. She stepped unconcernedly over the first rail. She could never tell how it happened. The ensuing 30 seconds always seemed in her recollection like a chaotic nightmare in which she endured the agony of 1,000 lifetimes. The heel of her pretty, foolish shoe caught in a crevice of the switch. She could not pull it loose. "Barney, Barney," she called in alarm. Barney turned, saw her predicament, saw her ashen face, dashed back. He tried to pull her clear. He tried to wrench her foot from the prisoning hold. In vain. In a moment the train would sweep around the curve, would be on them. "Go, go, quick, you'll be killed, Barney," shrieked Valancy, trying to push him away. Barney dropped on his knees, ghost white, frantically tearing at her shoelace. The knot defied his trembling fingers. He snatched a knife from his pocket and slashed at it. Valancy still strove blindly to push him away. Her mind was full of the hideous thought that Barney was going to be killed. She had no thought for her own danger. "Barney, go, go, for God's sake, go." "Never," muttered Barney between his set teeth. He gave one mad wrench at the lace. As the train thundered around the curve, he sprang up and caught Valancy, dragging her clear, leaving the shoe behind her. The wind from the train as it swept by turned to icy cold the streaming perspiration on his face. "Thank God," he breathed. For a moment they stood stupidly staring at each other, two white, shaken, wild-eyed creatures. Then they stumbled over to the little seat at the end of the station house and dropped on it. Barney buried his face in his hands and said not a word. Valancy sat, staring straight ahead of her with unseeing eyes at the great pine woods, the stumps of the clearing, the long, gleaming rails. There was only one thought in her dazed mind, a thought that seemed to burn it as a shaving of fire might burn her body. Dr. Trent had told her over a year ago that she had a serious form of heart disease, that any excitement might be fatal. If that were so, why was she not dead now? This very minute? She had just experienced as much and as terrible excitement as most people experience in a lifetime, crowded into that endless 30 seconds. Yet she had not died of it. She was not an iota the worse for it. A little wobbly at the knees as anyone would have been. A quicker heartbeat, as anyone would have, nothing more. Why? Was it possible Dr. Trent had made a mistake? Valancy shivered as if a cold wind had suddenly chilled her to the soul. She looked at Barney, hunched up beside her. His silence was very eloquent. Had the same thought occurred to him? Did he suddenly find himself confronted by the appalling suspicion that he was married, not for a few months or a year, but for good and all to a woman he did not love and who had foisted herself upon him by some trick or lie? Valancy turned sick before the horror of it. It could not be. It would be too cruel, too devilish. Dr. Trent couldn't have made a mistake. Impossible. He was one of the best heart specialists in Ontario. She was foolish, unnerved by the recent horror. She remembered some of the hideous spasms of pain she had had. There must be something serious the matter with her heart to account for them. But she had not had any for nearly 3 months. Why? Presently Barney bestirred himself. He stood up, without looking at Valancy, and said casually, "I suppose we'd better be hiking back. Sun's getting low. Are you good for the rest of the road?" "I think so," said Valancy miserably. Barney went across the clearing and picked up the parcel he had dropped, the parcel containing her new shoes. He brought it to her and let her take out the shoes and put them on without any assistance, while he stood with his back to her and looked out over the pines. They walked in silence down the shadowy trail to the lake. In silence Barney steered his boat into the sunset miracle that was Muskoka. In silence they went around feathery headlands and across coral bays and silver rivers where canoes were slipping up and down in the afterglow. In silence they went past cottages echoing with music and laughter. In silence drew up at the landing place below the blue castle. Valancy went up the rock steps and into the house. She dropped miserably on the first chair she came to and sat there staring through the oriel, oblivious of good luck's frantic purrs of joy and Banjo's savage glares of protest at her occupancy of his chair. Barney came in a few minutes later. He did not come near her, but he stood behind her and asked gently if she felt any the worse for her experience. Valancy would have given her year of happiness to have been able honestly to answer yes. "No," she said flatly. Barney went into Bluebeard's chamber and shut the door. She heard him pacing up and down, up and down. He had never paced like that before. And an hour ago, only an hour ago, she had been so happy. Chapter 36. Finally Valancy went to bed. Before she went she reread Dr. Trent's letter. It comforted her a little. So positive, so assured, the writing so black and steady. Not the writing of a man who didn't know what he was writing about. But she could not sleep. She pretended to be asleep when Barney came in. Barney pretended to go to sleep. But Valancy knew perfectly well he wasn't sleeping any more than she was. She knew he was lying there, staring through the darkness. Thinking of what? Trying to face what? Valancy, who had spent so many happy wakeful hours of night lying by that window, now paid the price of them all in this one night of misery. A horrible, portentous fact was slowly looming out before her from the nebula of surmise and fear. She could not shut her eyes to it, push it away, ignore it. There could be nothing seriously wrong with her heart, no matter what Dr. Trent had said. If there had been, those 30 seconds would have killed her. It was no use to recall Dr. Trent's letter and reputation. The greatest specialists made mistakes sometimes. Dr. Trent had made one. Towards morning Valancy fell into a fitful dose with ridiculous dreams. One of them was of Barney taunting her with having tricked him. In her dream, she lost her temper and struck him violently on the head with her rolling pin. He proved to be made of glass and shivered into splinters all over the floor. She woke with a cry of horror, a gasp of relief, a short laugh over the absurdity of her dream, a miserable, sickening recollection of what had happened. Barney was gone. Valancy knew, as people sometimes know things, inescapably without being told, that he was not in the house or in Bluebeard's chamber either. There was a curious silence in the living room, a silence with something uncanny about it. The old clock had stopped. Barney must have forgotten to wind it up, something he had never done before. The room without it was dead, though the sunshine streamed in through the oriel and dimples of light from the dancing waves beyond quivered over the walls. The canoe was gone, but Lady Jane was under the mainland trees. So Barney had betaken himself to the wilds. He would not return till night, perhaps not even then. He must be angry with her. That furious silence of his must mean anger, cold, deep, justifiable resentment. Well, Valancy knew what she must do first. She was not suffering very keenly now, yet the curious numbness that pervaded her being was in a way worse than pain. It was as if something in her had died. She forced herself to cook and eat a little breakfast. Mechanically, she put the blue castle in perfect order. Then she put on her hat and coat, locked the door and hid the key in the hollow of the old pine, and crossed to the mainland in the motorboat. She was going into Deerwood to see Dr. Trent. She must know. Chapter 37. Dr. Trent looked at her blankly and fumbled among his recollections. Mrs. Snaith, said Valancy quietly. I was Miss Valancy Stirling when I came to you last May, over a year ago. I wanted to consult you about my heart. Dr. Trent's face cleared. Oh, of course. I remember now. I'm really not to blame for not knowing you. You've changed, splendidly, and married. Well, it has agreed with you. You don't look much like an invalid now, hey? I remember that day. I was badly upset. Hearing about poor Ned bowled me over. But Ned's as good as new and you, too, evidently. I told you so, you know. Told you there was nothing to worry over. Valancy looked at him. You told me in your letter, she said slowly, with a curious feeling that someone else was talking through her lips, that I had angina pectoris, in the last stages, complicated with an aneurysm, that I might die any minute, that I couldn't live longer than a year. Dr. Trent stared at her. Impossible, he said blankly. I couldn't have told you that. Valancy took his letter from her bag and handed it to him. Miss Valancy Stirling, he read. Yes. Of course I wrote you on the train that night, but I told you there was nothing serious. Read your letter, insisted Valancy. Dr. Trent took it out, unfolded it, glanced over it. A dismayed look came into his face. He jumped to his feet and strode agitatedly about the room. Good heavens! This is the letter I meant for old Miss Jane Stirling, from Port Lawrence. She was here that day, too. I sent you the wrong letter. What unpardonable carelessness! But I was beside myself that night. My God, and you believed that. You believed, but you didn't. You went to another doctor. Valancy stood up, turned round, looked foolishly about her, and sat down again. I believed it, she said faintly. I didn't go to any other doctor. It would take too long to explain, but I believed I was going to die soon. Dr. Trent halted before her. I can never forgive myself. What a year you must have had. But you don't look. I can't understand. Never mind, said Valancy dully. And so there's nothing the matter with my heart? Well, nothing serious. You had what is called pseudo-angina. It's never fatal, passes away completely with proper treatment, or sometimes with a shock of joy. Have you been troubled much with it? Not at all since March, answered Valancy. She remembered the marvelous feeling of recreation she had had when she saw Barney coming home safe after the storm. Had that shock of joy cured her? Then likely you're all right. I told you what to do in the letter you should have got. And of course I supposed you'd go to another doctor. Child, why didn't you? I didn't want anybody to know. Idiot, said Dr. Trent bluntly. I can't understand such folly. And poor old Miss Stirling. She must have got your letter, telling her there was nothing serious the matter. Well, it couldn't have made any difference. Her case was hopeless. Nothing that she could have done or left undone could have made any difference. I was surprised she lived as long as she did, 2 months. She was here that day, not long before you. I hated to tell her the truth. You think I'm a blunt old curmudgeon, and my letters are blunt enough. I can't soften things, but I'm a sniveling coward when it comes to telling a woman face to face that she's got to die soon. I told her I'd look up some features of the case I wasn't quite sure of and let her know next day. But you got her letter. Look here, dear Miss Stirling. Yes, I noticed that, but I thought it a mistake. I didn't know there were any Stirlings in Port Lawrence. She was the only one, a lonely old soul, lived by herself with only a little home girl. She died 2 months after she was here, died in her sleep. My mistake couldn't have made any difference to her. But you, I can't forgive myself for inflicting a year's misery on you. It's time I retired, all right, when I do things like that, even if my son was supposed to be fatally injured. Can you ever forgive me? A year of misery. Valancy smiled a tortured smile as she thought of all the happiness Dr. Trent's mistake had bought her. But she was paying for it now. Oh, she was paying. If to feel was to live, she was living with a vengeance. She let Dr. Trent examine her and answered all his questions. When he told her she was fit as a fiddle and would probably live to be 100, she got up and went away silently. She knew that there were a great many horrible things outside waiting to be thought over. Dr. Trent thought she was odd. Anybody would have thought, from her hopeless eyes and woebegone face, that he had given her a sentence of death instead of life. Snaith? Snaith? Who the devil had she married? He had never heard of Snaiths in Deerwood, and she had been such a sallow, faded, little old maid. Gad, but marriage had made a difference in her. Anyhow, whoever Snaith was. Snaith? Dr. Trent remembered. That rapscallion, up back? Had Valancy Stirling married him? And her clan had let her. Well, probably that solved the mystery. She had married in haste and repented at leisure, and that was why she wasn't overjoyed at learning she was a good insurance prospect, after all. Married? To God knew whom. Or what? Jailbird? Defaulter? Fugitive from justice? It must be pretty bad if she had looked to death as a release, poor girl. But why were women such fools? Dr. Trent dismissed Valancy from his mind, though to the day of his death he was ashamed of putting those letters into the wrong envelopes. Chapter 38. Valancy walked quickly through the back streets and through Lover's Lane. She did not want to meet anyone she knew. She didn't want to meet even people she didn't know. She hated to be seen. Her mind was so confused, so torn, so messy. She felt that her appearance must be the same. She drew a sobbing breath of relief as she left the village behind and found herself on the up-back road. There was little fear of meeting anyone she knew here. The cars that fled by her with raucous shrieks were filled with strangers. One of them was packed with young people who whirled past her singing uproariously. My wife has the fever, oh then, my wife has the fever, oh then, my wife has the fever. Oh, I hope it won't leave her, for I want to be single again. Valancy flinched as if one of them had leaned from the car and cut her across the face with a whip. She had made a covenant with death, and death had cheated her. Now life stood mocking her. She had trapped Barney, trapped him into marrying her. And divorce was so hard to get in Ontario, so expensive, and Barney was poor. With life, fear had come back into her heart. Sickening fear. Fear of what Barney would think, would say. Fear of the future that must be lived without him. Fear of her insulted, repudiated clan. She had had one draught from a divine cup, and now it was dashed from her lips, with no kind, friendly death to rescue her. She must go on living and longing for it. Everything was spoiled, smirched, defaced. Even that year in the Blue Castle. Even her unashamed love for Barney. It had been beautiful because death waited. Now it was only sordid because death was gone. How could anyone bear an unbearable thing? She must go back and tell him. Make him believe she had not meant to trick him. She must make him believe that. She must say goodbye to her Blue Castle and return to the brick house on Elm Street. Back to everything she had thought left behind forever. The old bondage, the old fears. But that did not matter. All that mattered now was that Barney must somehow be made to believe she had not consciously tricked him. When Valancy reached the pines by the lake, she was brought out of her daze of pain by a startling sight. There, parked by the side of old, battered, ragged Lady Jane, was another car. A wonderful car. A purple car. Not a dark, royal purple, but a blatant, screaming purple. It shone like a mirror, and its interior plainly indicated the car cast of Vere de Vere. On the driver's seat sat a haughty chauffeur in livery, and in the tonneau sat a man who opened the door and bounced out nimbly as Valancy came down the path to the landing place. He stood under the pines waiting for her, and Valancy took in every detail of him. A stout, short, pudgy man, with a broad, rubicund, good-humored face. A clean-shaven face, though an unparalyzed little imp at the back of Valancy's paralyzed mind suggested the thought. Such a face should have a fringe of white whisker around it. old-fashioned, steel-rimmed spectacles on prominent blue eyes. A pursy mouth, a little round, knobby nose. Where, groped Valancy. Had she seen that face before? It seemed as familiar to her as her own. The stranger wore a green hat and a light fawn overcoat over a suit of a loud check pattern. His tie was a brilliant green of lighter shade. On the plump hand he outstretched to intercept Valancy, an enormous diamond winked at her. But he had a pleasant, fatherly smile, and in his hearty, unmodulated voice was a ring of something that attracted her. "Can you tell me, miss, if that house yonder belongs to a Mr. Redfern? And if so, how can I get to it?" Redfern. A vision of bottles seemed to dance before Valancy's eyes. Long bottles of bitters, round bottles of hair tonic, square bottles of liniment, short, corpulent little bottles of purple pills, and all of them bearing that very prosperous, beaming moon face and steel-rimmed spectacles on the label. Dr. Redfern. "No," said Valancy faintly. "No, that house belongs to Mr. Snaith." Dr. Redfern nodded. "Yes, I understand Bernie's been calling himself Snaith. Well, it's his middle name. Was his poor mother's. Bernard Snaith Redfern, that's him. And now, miss, you can tell me how to get over to that island? Nobody seems to be home there. I've done some waving and yelling. Henry, there, wouldn't yell. He's a one-job man. But old Doc Redfern can yell with the best of them yet, and ain't above doing it. Raised nothing but a couple of crows. Guess Bernie's out for the day." "He was away when I left this morning," said Valancy. "I suppose he hasn't come home yet." She spoke flatly and tonelessly. This last shock had temporarily bereft her of whatever little power of reasoning had been left her by Dr. Trent's revelation. In the back of her mind the aforesaid little imp was jeeringly repeating a silly old proverb, "It never rains but it pours." But she was not trying to think. What was the use? Dr. Redfern was gazing at her in perplexity. "When you left this morning, do you live over there?" He waved his diamond at the blue castle. "Of course," said Valancy stupidly. "I'm his wife." Dr. Redfern took out a yellow silk handkerchief, removed his hat, and mopped his brow. He was very bald, and Valancy's imp whispered, "Why be bald? Why lose your manly beauty? Try Redfern's hair vigor. It keeps you young." "Excuse me," said Dr. Redfern. "This is a bit of a shock." Shock seemed to be in the air this morning. The imp said this out loud before Valancy could prevent it. "I didn't know Bernie was married. I didn't think he would have got married without telling his old dad." Were Dr. Redfern's eyes misty? Amid her own dull ache of misery and fear and dread, Valancy felt a pang of pity for him. "Don't blame him," she said hurriedly. It wasn't his fault. It was all my doing." "You didn't ask him to marry you, I suppose?" twinkled Dr. Redfern. "He might have let me know. I'd have got acquainted with my daughter-in-law before this if he had. But I'm glad to meet you now, my dear, very glad. You look like a sensible young woman. I used to sort of fear Barney'd pick out some pretty bit of fluff just because she was good-looking. They were all after him, of course. Wanted his money? Didn't like the pills and the bitters, but liked the dollars. Wanted to dip their pretty little fingers in old Doc's millions. Millions, said Valancy faintly. She wished she could sit down somewhere. She wished she could have a chance to think. She wished she and the blue castle could sink to the bottom of Mistawis and vanish from human sight forevermore. "Millions," said Dr. Redfern complacently, "and Bernie chucks them for that." Again he shook the diamond contemptuously at the blue castle. "Wouldn't you think he'd have more sense? And all on account of a white bit of a girl. He must have got over that feeling, anyhow, since he's married. You must persuade him to come back to civilization. All nonsense wasting his life like this. Ain't you going to take me over to your house, my dear? I suppose you've some way of getting there." "Of course," said Valancy stupidly. She led the way down to the little cove where the disappearing propeller boat was snuggled. "Does your man want to come, too?" "Who?" "Henry." "Not he. Look at him sitting there disapproving. Disapproves of the whole expedition. The trail up from the road nearly gave him a conniption. Well, it was a devilish road to put a car on. Whose old bus is that up there?" "Barney's." "Good Lord. Does Bernie Redfern ride in a thing like that? It looks like the great-great-grandmother of all the Fords. It isn't a Ford. It's a gray Slauson, said Valancy spiritedly. For some occult reason, Dr. Redfern's good-humored ridicule of dear old Lady Jane stung her to life. A life that was all pain but still life. Better than the horrible half-dead and half-aliveness of the past few minutes or years. She waved Dr. Redfern curtly into the boat and took him over to the Blue Castle. The key was still in the old pine, the house still silent and deserted. Valancy took the doctor through the living room to the western veranda. She must at least be out where there was air. It was still sunny, but in the southwest a great thundercloud, with white crests and gorges of purple shadow, was slowly rising over Mistawis. The doctor dropped with a gasp on a rustic chair and mopped his brow again. Warm, eh? Lord, what a view! Wonder if it would soften Henry if he could see it. Have you had dinner? Asked Valancy. Yes, my dear. Had it before we left Port Lawrence. Didn't know what sort of wild hermit's hollow we were coming to, you see. Hadn't any idea I was going to find a nice little daughter-in-law here all ready to toss me up a meal. Cats, eh? Puss, puss. See that? Cats love me. Bernie was always fond of cats. It's about the only thing he took from me. He's his poor mother's boy. Valancy had been thinking idly that Barney must resemble his mother. She had remained standing by the steps, but Dr. Redfern waved her to the swing seat. Sit down, dear. Never stand when you can sit. I want to get a good look at Barney's wife. Well, I like your face. No beauty, you don't mind my saying that. You've sense enough to know it, I reckon. Sit down. Valancy sat down. To be obliged to sit still when mental agony urges us to stride up and down is the refinement of torture. Every nerve in her being was crying out to be alone, to be hidden. But she had to sit and listen to Dr. Redfern, who didn't mind talking at all. When do you think Bernie will be back? I don't know. Not before night, probably. Where did he go? I don't know that either. Likely to the woods, up back. So he doesn't tell you his comings and goings, either? Bernie was always a secretive young devil. Never understood him, just like his poor mother. But I thought a lot of him. It hurt me when he disappeared as he did. 11 years ago. I haven't seen my boy for 11 years. 11 years. Valancy was surprised. It's only 6 since he came here. Oh, he was in the Klondike before that, and all over the world. He used to drop me a line now and then. Never give any clue to where he was, but just a line to say he was all right. I suppose he's told you all about it. No, I know nothing of his past life, said Valancy with sudden eagerness. She wanted to know. She must know now. It hadn't mattered before. Now she must know all. And she could never hear it from Barney. She might never even see him again. If she did, it would not be to talk of his past. What happened? Why did he leave his home? Tell me. Tell me. Well, it ain't much of a story. Just a young fool gone mad because of a quarrel with his girl. Only Bernie was a stubborn fool. Always stubborn. You never could make that boy do anything he didn't want to do. From the day he was born. Yet he was always a quiet, gentle little chap too. Good as gold. His poor mother died when he was only 2 years old. I'd just begun to make money with my hair vigor. I dreamed the formula for it, you see. Some dream that. The cash rolled in. Bernie had everything he wanted. I sent him to the best schools, private schools. I meant to make a gentleman of him. Never had any chance myself. Meant he should have every chance. He went through McGill. Got honors and all that. I wanted him to go in for law. He hankered after journalism and stuff like that. Wanted me to buy a paper for him or back him in publishing what he called a real, worthwhile, honest-to-goodness Canadian magazine. I suppose I'd have done it. I always did what he wanted me to do. Wasn't he all I had to live for? I wanted him to be happy, and he never was happy. Can you believe it? Not that he said so, but I'd always a feeling that he wasn't happy. Everything he wanted, all the money he could spend, his own bank account, travel, seeing the world, but he wasn't happy. Not till he fell in love with Ethel Traverse. Then he was happy for a little while. The cloud had reached the sun and a great, chill, purple shadow came swiftly over Mistawis. It touched the blue castle, rolled over it. Valancy shivered. Yes, she said, with painful eagerness, though every word was cutting her to the heart. What was she like? Prettiest girl in Montreal, said Dr. Redfern. Oh, she was a looker, all right. Eh, gold hair, shiny as silk, great, big, soft, black eyes, skin like milk and roses. Don't wonder Bernie fell for her. And brains as well. She wasn't a bit of fluff. B.A. from McGill. A thoroughbred, too. One of the best families. But a bit lean in the purse. Eh, Bernie was mad about her. Happiest young fool you ever saw. Then, the bust-up. What happened? Valancy had taken off her hat and was absently thrusting a pin in and out of it. Good Luck was purring beside her. Banjo was regarding Dr. Redfern with suspicion. Nip and Tuck were lazily cawing in the pines. Mistawis was beckoning. Everything was the same. Nothing was the same. It was 100 years since yesterday. Yesterday, at this time, she and Barney had been eating a belated dinner here with laughter. Laughter? Valancy felt that she had done with laughter forever. And with tears, for that matter. She had no further use for either of them. Blessed if I know, my dear. Some fool quarrel, I suppose. Bernie just lit out, disappeared. He wrote me from the Yukon. Said his engagement was broken and he wasn't coming back. And not to try to hunt him up because he was never coming back. I didn't. What was the use? I knew Bernie. I went on piling up money because there wasn't anything else to do. But I was mighty lonely. All I lived for was them little notes now and then from Bernie, Klondike, England, South Africa, China, everywhere. I thought maybe he'd come back someday to his lonesome old dad. Then 6 years ago, even the letters stopped. I didn't hear a word of or from him till last Christmas. Did he write? No, but he drew a check for $15,000 on his bank account. The bank manager is a friend of mine, one of my biggest shareholders. He'd always promised me he'd let me know if Bernie drew any checks. Bernie had $50,000 there, and he'd never touched a cent of it till last Christmas. The check was made out to Ainsley's, Toronto. Ainsley's? Valancy heard herself saying Ainsley's. She had a box on her dressing table with the Ainsley trademark. Yes, the big jeweler house there. After I'd thought it over a while, I got brisk. I wanted to locate Bernie. Had a special reason for it. It was time he gave up his fool hoboing and come to his senses. Drawing that 15 told me there was something in the wind. The manager communicated with the Ainsleys. His wife was an Ainsley, and found out that Bernard Redfern had bought a pearl necklace there. His address was given as Box 444, Port Lawrence, Muskoka, Ontario. First I thought I'd write. Then I thought I'd wait till the open season for cars and come down myself. Ain't no hand at writing. I've motored from Montreal. Got to Port Lawrence yesterday. Inquired at the post office. Told me they knew nothing of any Bernard Snaith Redfern, but there was a Barney Snaith had a P.O. box there. Lived on an island out here, they said. So here I am. And where's Barney? Valancy was fingering her necklace. She was wearing $15,000 around her neck, and she had worried lest Barney had paid $15 for it and couldn't afford it. Suddenly she laughed in Dr. Redfern's face. Excuse me. It's so amusing, said poor Valancy. Isn't it? Said Dr. Redfern, seeing a joke, but not exactly hers. Now, you seem like a sensible young woman, and I dare say you've lots of influence over Bernie. Can't you get him to come back to civilization and live like other people? I've a house up there, big as a castle, furnished like a palace. I want company in it, Bernie's wife, Bernie's children. Did Ethel Travers ever marry? Queried Valancy irrelevantly. Bless you, yes. 2 years after Bernie Levant. But she's a widow now, pretty as ever. To be frank, that was my special reason for wanting to find Bernie. I thought they'd make it up, maybe. But of course, that's all off now. Doesn't matter. Bernie's choice of a wife is good enough for me. It's my boy I want. Think he'll soon be back? I don't know, but I don't think he'll come before night. Quite late, perhaps. And perhaps not till tomorrow. But I can put you up comfortably. He'll certainly be back tomorrow. Dr. Redfern shook his head. Too damp. I'll take no chances with rheumatism. Why suffer that ceaseless anguish? Why not try Redfern's liniment? Quoted the imp in the back of Valancy's mind. I must get back to Port Lawrence before rain starts. Henry goes quite mad when he gets mud on the car. But I'll come back tomorrow. Meanwhile, you talk Bernie into reason." He shook her hand and patted her kindly on the shoulder. He looked as if he would have kissed her, with a little encouragement, but Valancy did not give it. Not that she would have minded. He was rather dreadful and loud, and dreadful. But there was something about him she liked. She thought dully that she might have liked being his daughter-in-law if he had not been a millionaire. A score of times over. And Barney was his son, and heir. She took him over in the motorboat and watched the lordly purple car roll away through the woods with Henry at the wheel looking things not lawful to be uttered. Then she went back to the Blue Castle. What she had to do must be done quickly. Barney might return at any moment. And it was certainly going to rain. She was thankful she no longer felt very bad. When you are bludgeoned on the head repeatedly, you naturally and mercifully become more or less insensible and stupid. She stood briefly like a faded flower bitten by frost, by the hearth, looking down on the white ashes of the last fire that had blazed in the Blue Castle. At any rate, she thought wearily, Barney isn't poor. He will be able to afford a divorce. Quite nicely. Chapter 39. She must write a note. The imp in the back of her mind laughed. In every story she had ever read, when a runaway wife decamped from home, she left a note, generally on the pincushion. It was not a very original idea, but one had to leave something intelligible. What was there to do but write a note? She looked vaguely about her for something to write with. Ink? There was none. Valancy had never written anything since she had come to the Blue Castle, save memoranda of household necessaries for Barney. A pencil sufficed for them, but now the pencil was not to be found. Valancy absently crossed to the door of Bluebeard's chamber and tried it. She vaguely expected to find it locked, but it opened unresistingly. She had never tried it before, and did not know whether Barney habitually kept it locked or not. If he did, he must have been badly upset to leave it unlocked. She did not realize that she was doing something he had told her not to do. She was only looking for something to write with. All her faculties were concentrated on deciding just what she would say and how she would say it. There was not the slightest curiosity in her as she went into the lean-to. There were no beautiful women hanging by their hair on the walls. It seemed a very harmless apartment, with a commonplace little sheet iron stove in the middle of it, its pipes sticking out through the roof. At one end was a table or counter crowded with odd-looking utensils, used no doubt by Barney in his smelly operations. Chemical experiments, probably, she reflected dully. At the other end was a big writing desk and swivel chair. The side walls were lined with books. Valancy went blindly to the desk. There she stood motionless for a few minutes, looking down at something that lay on it. A bundle of galley proofs. The page on top bore the title Wild Honey, and under the title were the words by John Foster. The opening sentence, "Pines are the trees of myth and legend. They strike their roots deep into the traditions of an older world, but wind and star love their lofty tops. What music when old Aeolus draws his bow across the branches of the pines," she had heard Barney say that one day when they walked under them. So Barney was John Foster. Valancy was not excited. She had absorbed all the shocks and sensations that she could compass for one day. This affected her neither one way nor the other. She only thought, so this explains it. It was a small matter that had, somehow, stuck in her mind more persistently than its importance seemed to justify. Soon after Barney had brought her John Foster's latest book, she had been in a Port Lawrence bookshop and heard a customer ask the proprietor for John Foster's new book. The proprietor had said curtly, "Not out yet. Won't be out till next week." Valancy had opened her lips to say, "Oh, yes, it is out," but closed them again. After all, it was none of her business. She supposed the proprietor wanted to cover up his negligence in not getting the book in promptly. Now she knew. The book Barney had given her had been one of the author's complimentary copies, sent in advance. Well, Valancy pushed the proofs indifferently aside and sat down in the swivel chair. She took up Barney's pen, and a vile one it was, pulled a sheet of paper to her and began to write. She could not think of anything to say except bald facts. "Dear Barney, I went to Dr. Trent this morning and found out he had sent me the wrong letter by mistake. There never was anything serious the matter with my heart, and I am quite well now. I did not mean to trick you. Please believe that. I could not bear it if you did not believe that. I am very sorry for the mistake. But surely you can get a divorce if I leave you. Is desertion a ground for divorce in Canada? Of course, if there is anything I can do to help or hasten it, I will do it gladly, if your lawyer will let me know. I thank you for all your kindness to me. I shall never forget it. Think as kindly of me as you can, because I did not mean to trap you. Goodbye. Yours gratefully, Valancy. It was very cold and stiff, she knew. But to try to say anything else would be dangerous, like tearing away a dam. She didn't know what torrent of wild incoherences and passionate anguish might pour out. In a postscript she added, "Your father was here today. He is coming back tomorrow. He told me everything. I think you should go back to him. He is very lonely for you." She put the letter in an envelope, wrote Barney across it, and left it on the desk. On it she laid the string of pearls. If they had been the beads she believed them, she would have kept them in memory of that wonderful year. But she could not keep the $15,000 gift of a man who had married her out of pity and whom she was now leaving. It hurt her to give up her pretty bauble. That was an odd thing, she reflected. The fact that she was leaving Barney did not hurt her, yet. It lay at her heart like a cold, insensible thing. If it came to life. Valancy shuddered and went out. She put on her hat and mechanically fed Good Luck and Banjo. She locked the door and carefully hid the key in the old pine. Then she crossed to the mainland in the disappearing propeller. She stood for a moment on the bank, looking at her blue castle. The rain had not yet come, but the sky was dark and Mistawi's gray and sullen. The little house under the pines looked very pathetic. A casket rifled of its jewels, a lamp with its flame blown out. I shall never again hear the wind crying over Mistawi's at night, thought Valancy. This hurt her, too. She could have laughed to think that such a trifle could hurt her at such a time. Chapter 40. Valancy paused a moment on the porch of the brick house in Elm Street. She felt that she ought to knock like a stranger. Her rose bush, she idly noticed, was loaded with buds. The rubber plant stood beside the prim door. A momentary horror overcame her, a horror of the existence to which she was returning. Then she opened the door and walked in. I wonder if the prodigal son ever felt really at home again, she thought. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles were in the sitting room. Uncle Benjamin was there, too. They looked blankly at Valancy, realizing at once that something was wrong. This was not the saucy, impudent thing who had laughed at them in this very room last summer. This was a gray-faced woman with the eyes of a creature who had been stricken by a mortal blow. Valancy looked indifferently around the room. She had changed so much, and it had changed so little. The same pictures hung on the walls. The little orphan who knelt at her never-finished prayer by the bed whereon reposed the black kitten that never grew up into a cat. The gray steel engraving of Cotter Bras, where the British regiment forever stood at bay. The crayon enlargement of the boyish father she had never known. There they all hung in the same places. The green cascade of Wandering Jew still tumbled out of the old granite saucepan on the window stand. The same elaborate, never-used pitcher stood at the same angle on the sideboard shelf. The blue and gilt vases that had been among her mother's wedding presents still primly adorned the mantelpiece, flanking the china clock of Barost and besprayed where that never went. The chairs in exactly the same places. Her mother and Cousin Stickles, likewise unchanged, regarding her with stony unwelcome. Valancy had to speak first. "I've come home, Mother," she said tiredly. "So I see." Mrs. Frederick's voice was very icy. She had resigned herself to Valancy's desertion. She had almost succeeded in forgetting there was a Valancy. She had rearranged and organized her systematic life without any reference to an ungrateful, rebellious child. She had taken her place again in a society which ignored the fact that she had ever had a daughter and pitted her, if it pitted her at all, only in discreet whispers and asides. The plain truth was that, by this time, Mrs. Frederick did not want Valancy to come back, did not want ever to see or hear of her again. And now, of course, Valancy was here, with tragedy and disgrace and scandal trailing after her visibly. "So I see," said Mrs. Frederick. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm not going to die," said Valancy huskily. God bless my soul, said Uncle Benjamin. Who said you were going to die? I suppose, said Cousin Stickles shrewishly. Cousin Stickles did not want Valancy back either. I suppose you found out he has another wife, as we've been sure all along. No, I only wish he had, said Valancy. She was not suffering particularly, but she was very tired. If only the explanations were all over and she were upstairs in her old, ugly room, alone. Just alone. The rattle of the beads on her mother's sleeves, as they swung on the arms of the reed chair, almost drove her crazy. Nothing else was worrying her. But all at once it seemed that she simply could not endure that thin, insistent rattle. My home, as I told you, is always open to you, said Mrs. Frederick stonily, but I can never forgive you. Valancy gave a mirthless laugh. I'd care very little for that if I could only forgive myself, she said. Come, come, said Uncle Benjamin testily, but rather enjoying himself. He felt he had Valancy under his thumb again. We've had enough of mystery. What has happened? Why have you left that fellow? No doubt there's reason enough, but what particular reason is it? Valancy began to speak mechanically. She told her tale bluntly and barely. A year ago, Dr. Trent told me I had angina pectoris and could not live long. I wanted to have some life before I died. That's why I went away. Why I married Barney. And now I've found it is all a mistake. There is nothing wrong with my heart. I've got to live, and Barney only married me out of pity. So I have to leave him free. God bless me, said Uncle Benjamin. Cousin Stickles began to cry. Valancy, if you'd only had confidence in your own mother. Yes, yes, I know, said Valancy impatiently. What's the use of going into that now? I can't undo this year. God knows I wish I could. I've tricked Barney into marrying me, and he's really Bernard Redfern, Dr. Redfern's son, of Montreal, and his father wants him to go back to him. Uncle Benjamin made a queer sound. Cousin Stickles took her black-bordered handkerchief away from her eyes and stared at Valancy. A queer gleam suddenly shot into Mrs. Frederick's stone-gray orbs. Dr. Redfern, not the purple pill man, she said. Valancy nodded. He's John Foster, too, the writer of those nature books. But, Mrs. Frederick was visibly agitated, though not over the thought that she was the mother-in-law of John Foster. Dr. Redfern is a millionaire. Uncle Benjamin shut his mouth with a snap. 10 times over, he said. Valancy nodded. Yes, Barney left home years ago, because of some trouble, some disappointment. Now he will likely go back. So you see, I had to come home. He doesn't love me. I can't hold him to a bond he was tricked into. Uncle Benjamin looked incredibly sly. Did he say so? Does he want to get rid of you? No, I haven't seen him since I found out. But I tell you, he only married me out of pity, because I asked him to, because he thought it would only be for a little while. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles both tried to speak, but Uncle Benjamin waved a hand at them and frowned portentously. Let me handle this, wave and frown seemed to say. To Valancy, well, dear, we'll talk it all over later. You see, we don't quite understand everything yet. As Cousin Stickles says, you should have confided in us before. Later on, I dare say we can find a way out of this. You think Barney can easily get a divorce, don't you? Said Valancy eagerly. Uncle Benjamin silenced with another wave the exclamation of horror he knew was trembling on Mrs. Frederick's lips. Trust to me, Valancy. Everything will arrange itself. Tell me this, Dossie. Have you been happy up back? Was Senior, Mr. Redfern, good to you? I have been very happy, and Barney was very good to me, said Valancy, as if reciting a lesson. She remembered when she studied grammar at school she had disliked the past and perfect tenses. They had always seemed so pathetic. I have been. It was all over and done with. Then don't worry, little girl. How amazingly paternal Uncle Benjamin was. Your family will stand behind you. We'll see what can be done. Thank you, said Valancy dully. Really, it was quite decent of Uncle Benjamin. Can I go and lie down a little while? I'm tired. Of course you're tired. Uncle Benjamin patted her hand gently, very gently, all worn out and nervous. Go and lie down, by all means. You'll see things in quite a different light after you've had a good sleep." He held the door open. As she went through, he whispered, "What is the best way to keep a man's love?" Valancy smiled wanly. But she had come back to the old life, the old shackles. "What?" she asked as meekly as of yore. "Not to return it," said Uncle Benjamin with a chuckle. He shut the door and rubbed his hands, nodded and smiled mysteriously round the room. "Poor little Doss," he said pathetically. "Do you really suppose that Snaith can actually be Dr. Redfern's son?" gasped Mrs. Frederick. "I see no reason for doubting it. She says Dr. Redfern has been there. Why, the man is rich as wedding cake. Amelia, I've always believed there was more in Doss than most people thought. You kept her down too much, repressed her. She never had a chance to show what was in her. And now she's landed a millionaire for a husband." "But," hesitated Mrs. Frederick, they told terrible tales about him. All gossip and invention, all gossip and invention. It's always been a mystery to me why people should be so ready to invent and circulate slanders about other people they know absolutely nothing about. I can't understand why you paid so much attention to gossip and surmise. Just because he didn't choose to mix up with everybody, people resented it. I was surprised to find what a decent fellow he seemed to be that time he came into my store with Valancy. I discounted all the yarns then and there. But he was seen dead drunk in Port Lawrence once," said Cousin Stickles, doubtfully, yet is one very willing to be convinced to the contrary. "Who saw him?" demanded Uncle Benjamin truculently. "Who saw him?" "Old Jemmy Strang said he saw him." "I wouldn't take old Jemmy Strang's word on oath. He's too drunk himself half the time to see straight. He said he saw him lying drunk on a bench in the park. Pshaw, Redfern's been asleep there. Don't worry over that." "But his clothes, and that awful old car," said Mrs. Frederick uncertainly. "Eccentricities of genius," declared Uncle Benjamin. "You heard Doss say he was John Foster. I'm not up in literature myself, but I heard a lecturer from Toronto say that John Foster's books had put Canada on the literary map of the world." "I suppose we must forgive her," yielded Mrs. Frederick. "Forgive her?" Uncle Benjamin snorted. Really, Amelia was an incredibly stupid woman. No wonder poor Doss had gone sick and tired of living with her. "Well, yes, I think you'd better forgive her. The question is, will Snaith forgive us? What if she persists in leaving him? You've no idea how stubborn she can be," said Mrs. Frederick. "Leave it all to me, Amelia. Leave it all to me. You women have muddled it enough. This whole affair has been bungled from start to finish. If you had put yourself to a little trouble years ago, Amelia, she would not have bolted over the traces as she did. Just let her alone. Don't worry her with advice or questions till she's ready to talk. She's evidently run away in a panic because she's afraid he'd be angry with her for fooling him. Most extraordinary thing of Trent to tell her such a yarn. That's what comes of going to strange doctors. Well, we mustn't blame her too harshly, poor child. Redfern will come after her. If he doesn't, I'll hunt him up and talk to him as man to man. He may be a millionaire, but Valancy is a Stirling. He can't repudiate her just because she was mistaken about her heart disease. Not likely he'll want to. Doss is a little overstrung. Bless me, I must get in the habit of calling her Valancy. She isn't a baby any longer. Now, remember, Amelia, be very kind and sympathetic." It was something of a large order to expect Mrs. Frederick to be kind and sympathetic, but she did her best. When supper was ready, she went up and asked Valancy if she wouldn't like a cup of tea. Valancy, lying on her bed, declined. She just wanted to be left alone for a while. Mrs. Frederick left her alone. She did not even remind Valancy that her plight was the outcome of her own lack of daughterly respect and obedience. One could not, exactly, say things like that to the daughter-in-law of a millionaire. Chapter 41. Valancy looked dully about her old room. It, too, was so exactly the same that it seemed almost impossible to believe in the changes that had come to her since she had last slept in it. It seemed, somehow, indecent that it should be so much the same. There was Queen Louise everlastingly coming down the stairway, and nobody had let the forlorn puppy in out of the rain. Here was the purple paper blind and the greenish mirror. Outside, the old carriage shop with its blatant advertisements. Beyond it, The station with the same derelicts and flirtatious flappers. Here the old life waited for her, like some grim ogre that bided his time and licked his chops. A monstrous horror of it suddenly possessed her. When night fell and she had undressed and got into bed, the merciful numbness passed away and she lay in anguish and thought of her island under the stars. The campfires, all their little household jokes and phrases and catchwords, their furry beautiful cats, the lights agleam on the fairy islands, canoes skimming over Mistawis in the magic of morning, white birches shining among the dark spruces like beautiful women's bodies, winter snows and rose-red sunset fires, lakes drunken with moonshine, all the delights of her lost paradise. She would not let herself think of Barney, only of these lesser things. She could not endure to think of Barney. Then she thought of him inescapably. She ached for him. She wanted his arms around her, his face against hers, his whispers in her ear. She recalled all his friendly looks and quips and jests, his little compliments, his caresses. She counted them all over as a woman might count her jewels. Not one did she miss from the first day they had met. These memories were all she could have now. She shut her eyes and prayed. Let me remember everyone, God. Let me never forget one of them. Yet it would be better to forget. This agony of longing and loneliness would not be so terrible if one could forget. And Ethel Traverse, that shimmering witch woman with her white skin and black eyes and shining hair. The woman Barney had loved. The woman whom he still loved. Hadn't he told her he never changed his mind? Who was waiting for him in Montreal? Who was the right wife for a rich and famous man? Barney would marry her, of course, when he got his divorce. How Valancy hated her and envied her. Barney had said, "I love you," to her. Valancy had wondered what tone Barney would say, "I love you" in. How his dark blue eyes would look when he said it. Ethel Traverse knew. Valancy hated her for the knowledge, hated and envied her. She can never have those hours in the blue castle. They are mine, thought Valancy savagely. Ethel would never make strawberry jam or dance to old Abel's fiddle or fry bacon for Barney over a campfire. She would never come to the little Mistawi's shack at all. What was Barney doing, thinking, feeling now? Had he come home and found her letter? Was he still angry with her? Or a little pitiful? Was he lying on their bed looking out on stormy Mistawi's and listening to the rain streaming down on the roof? Or was he still wandering in the wilderness, raging at the predicament in which he found himself? Hating her? Pain took her and wrung her like some great pitiless giant. She got up and walked the floor. Would morning never come to end this hideous night? And yet what could morning bring her? The old life without the old stagnation that was at least bearable. The old life with the new memories, the new longings, the new anguish. "Oh, why can't I die?" moaned Valancy. Chapter 42. It was not until early afternoon the next day that a dreadful old car clanked up Elm Street and stopped in front of the brick house. A hatless man sprang from it and rushed up the steps. The bell was rung as it had never been rung before, vehemently, intensely. The ringer was demanding entrance, not asking it. Uncle Benjamin chuckled as he hurried to the door. Uncle Benjamin had just dropped in to inquire how dear Doss Valancy was. Dear Doss Valancy, he had been informed, was just the same. She had come down for breakfast, which she didn't eat, gone back to her room, come down for dinner, which she didn't eat, gone back to her room. That was all. She had not talked, and she had been let, kindly, considerately, alone. Very good. Redfern will be here today, said Uncle Benjamin. And now Uncle Benjamin's reputation as a prophet was made. Redfern was here, unmistakably so. Is my wife here? He demanded of Uncle Benjamin without preface. Uncle Benjamin smiled expressively. Mr. Redfern, I believe? Very glad to meet you, sir. Yes, that naughty little girl of yours is here. We have been. I must see her. Barney cut Uncle Benjamin ruthlessly short. Certainly, Mr. Redfern. Just step in here. Valancy will be down in a minute. He ushered Barney into the parlor and betook himself to the sitting room and Mrs. Frederick. Go up and tell Valancy to come down. Her husband is here. But so dubious was Uncle Benjamin as to whether Valancy could really come down in a minute, or at all, that he followed Mrs. Frederick on tiptoe up the stairs and listened in the hall. Valancy dear, said Mrs. Frederick tenderly. Your husband is in the parlor, asking for you. Oh, mother. Valancy got up from the window and wrung her hands. I cannot see him, I cannot. Tell him to go away. Ask him to go away. I can't see him. Tell her, hissed Uncle Benjamin through the keyhole, that Redfern says he won't go away until he has seen her. Redfern had not said anything of the kind, but Uncle Benjamin thought he was that sort of a fellow. Valancy knew he was. She understood that she might as well go down first as last. She did not even look at Uncle Benjamin as she passed him on the landing. Uncle Benjamin did not mind. Rubbing his hands and chuckling, he retreated to the kitchen, where he genially demanded of Cousin Stickles, "Why are good husbands like bread?" Cousin Stickles asked why. "Because women need them," beamed Uncle Benjamin. Valancy was looking anything but beautiful when she entered the parlor. Her white night had played fearful havoc with her face. She wore an ugly old brown and blue gingham, having left all her pretty dresses in the blue castle. But Barney dashed across the room and caught her in his arms. "Valancy, darling, oh, you darling little idiot. Whatever possessed you to run away like that? When I came home last night and found your letter, I went quite mad. It was 12 o'clock. I knew it was too late to come here then. I walked the floor all night. Then this morning Dad came. I couldn't get away till now. Valancy, whatever got into you? Divorce, forsooth. Don't you know?" "I know you only married me out of pity," said Valancy, brushing him away feebly. "I know you don't love me, I know." "You've been lying awake at 3 o'clock too long," said Barney, shaking her. "That's all that's the matter with you. Love you? Oh, don't I love you? My girl, when I saw that train coming down on you, I knew whether I loved you or not." "Oh, I was afraid you would try to make me think you cared," cried Valancy passionately. Don't. I know all about Ethel Traverse. Your father told me everything. Oh, Barney, don't torture me. I can never go back to you." Barney released her and looked at her for a moment. Something in her pallid, resolute face spoke more convincingly than words of her determination. "Valancy," he said quietly, "Father couldn't have told you everything because he didn't know it. Will you let me tell you everything?" "Yes," said Valancy wearily. Oh, how dear he was. How she longed to throw herself into his arms. As he put her gently down in a chair, she could have kissed the slender, brown hands that touched her arms. She could not look up as he stood before her. She dared not meet his eyes. For his sake, she must be brave. She knew him, kind, unselfish. Of course he would pretend he did not want his freedom. She might have known he would pretend that, once the first shock of realization was over. He was so sorry for her. He understood her terrible position. When had he ever failed to understand? But she would never accept his sacrifice. Never. "You've seen Dad, and you know I'm Bernard Redfern. And I suppose you've guessed that I'm John Foster, since you went into Bluebeard's chamber." "Yes, but I didn't go in out of curiosity. I forgot you had told me not to go in." "I forgot?" "Never mind. I'm not going to kill you and hang you up on the wall, so there's no need to call for Sister Anne. I'm only going to tell you my story from the beginning. I came back last night intending to do it. Yes, I'm old Document Redfern's son, of Purple Pills and Bitters fame. Oh, don't I know it? Wasn't it rubbed into me for years?" Barney laughed bitterly and strode up and down the room a few times. Uncle Benjamin, tiptoeing through the hall, heard the laugh and frowned. Surely Doss wasn't going to be a stubborn little fool. Barney threw himself into a chair before Valancy. "Yes, as long as I can remember I've been a millionaire's son. But when I was born, Dad wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't even a doctor. Isn't yet. He was a veterinary and a failure at it. He and Mother lived in a little village up in Quebec and were abominably poor. I don't remember Mother. Haven't even a picture of her. She died when I was 2 years old. She was 15 years younger than Father, a little school teacher. When she died, Dad moved into Montreal and formed a company to sell his hair tonic. He dreamed the prescription one night, it seems. Well, it caught on. Money began to flow in. Dad invented, or dreamed, the other things, too. Pills, bitters, liniment, and so on. He was a millionaire by the time I was 10. With a house so big, a small chap like myself always felt lost in it. I had every toy a boy could wish for, and I was the loneliest little devil in the world. I remember only one happy day in my childhood, Valancy. Only one. Even you were better off than that. Dad had gone out to see an old friend in the country and took me along. I was turned loose in the barnyard, and I spent the whole day hammering nails in a block of wood. I had a glorious day. When I had to go back to my room full of playthings in the big house in Montreal, I cried. But I didn't tell Dad why. I never told him anything. It's always been a hard thing for me to tell things, Valancy. Anything that went deep, and most things went deep with me. I was a sensitive child, and I was even more sensitive as a boy. No one ever knew what I suffered. Dad never dreamed of it. When he sent me to a private school, I was only 11. The boys ducked me in the swimming tank until I stood on a table and read aloud all the advertisements of Father's patent abominations. I did it, then Barney clenched his fists. I was frightened and half drowned, and all my world was against me. But when I went to college and the Softs tried the same stunt, I didn't do it. Barney smiled grimly. They couldn't make me do it, but they could, and did, make my life miserable. I never heard the last of the pills and the bitters and the hair tonic. After using was my nickname. You see, I'd always such a thick thatch. My 4 college years were a nightmare. You know, or you don't know, what merciless beasts boys can be when they get a victim like me. I had few friends. There was always some barrier between me and the kind of people I cared for, and the other kind, who would have been very willing to be intimate with rich old document Redfern's son, I didn't care for. But I had one friend, or thought I had. A clever, bookish chap, a bit of a writer. That was a bond between us. I had some secret aspirations along that line. He was older than I was. I looked up to him and worshipped him. For a year I was happier than I'd ever been. Then, a burlesque sketch came out in the college magazine. A mordant thing, ridiculing Dad's remedies. The names were changed, of course, but everybody knew what and who was meant. Oh, it was clever, damnably so, and witty. McGill rocked with laughter over it. I found out. He had written it. Oh, were you sure? Valancy's dull eyes flamed with indignation. Yes. He admitted it when I asked him. Said a good idea was worth more to him than a friend, any time, and he added a gratuitous thrust. You know, Redfern, there are some things money won't buy. For instance, it won't buy you a grandfather. Well, it was a nasty slam. I was young enough to feel cut up, and it destroyed a lot of my ideals and illusions, which was the worst thing about it. I was a young misanthrope after that. Didn't want to be friends with anyone. And then, the year after I left college, I met Ethel Traverse. Valancy shivered. Barney, his hands stuck in his pockets, was regarding the floor moodily and didn't notice it. Dad told you about her, I suppose? She was very beautiful, and I loved her. Oh yes, I loved her. I won't deny it or belittle it now. It was a lonely, romantic boy's first passionate love, and it was very real. And I thought she loved me. I was fool enough to think that. I was wildly happy when she promised to marry me. For a few months. Then, I found out she didn't. I was an involuntary eavesdropper on a certain occasion for a moment. That moment was enough. The proverbial fate of the eavesdropper overtook me. A girlfriend of hers was asking her how she could stomach document Redfern's son and the patent medicine background. His money will gild the pills and sweeten the bitters, said Ethel with a laugh. Mother told me to catch him if I could. We're on the rocks. But Pa, I smell turpentine whenever he comes near me. Oh, Barney, cried Valancy, wrung with pity for him. She had forgotten all about herself and was filled with compassion for Barney and rage against Ethel Traverse. How dared she? Well, Barney got up and began pacing round the room. That finished me. Completely. I left civilization and those accursed dopes behind me and went to the Yukon. For 5 years I knocked about the world, in all sorts of outlandish places. I earned enough to live on. I wouldn't touch a cent of Dad's money. Then one day I woke up to the fact that I no longer cared a hang about Ethel, one way or another. She was somebody I'd known in another world, that was all. But I had no hankering to go back to the old life. None of that for me. I was free, and I meant to keep so. I came to Mistawis, saw Tom McMurray's Island. My first book had been published the year before and made a hit. I had a bit of money from my royalties. I bought my island, but I kept away from people. I had no faith in anybody. I didn't believe there was such a thing as real friendship or true love in the world. Not for me, anyhow, the son of purple pills. I used to revel in all the wild yarns they told of me. In fact, I'm afraid I suggested a few of them myself, by mysterious remarks which people interpreted in the light of their own prepossessions. Then, you came. I had to believe you loved me, really loved me, not my father's millions. There was no other reason why you should want to marry a penniless devil with my supposed record, and I was sorry for you. Oh, yes, I don't deny I married you because I was sorry for you. And then, I found you the best and jolliest and dearest little pal and chum a fellow ever had. Witty, loyal, sweet. You made me believe again in the reality of friendship and love. The world seemed good again just because you were in it, honey. I'd have been willing to go on forever just as we were. I knew that, the night I came home and saw my home light shining out from the island for the first time, and knew you were there waiting for me. After being homeless all my life, it was beautiful to have a home. To come home hungry at night and know there was a good supper and a cheery fire, and you. But I didn't realize what you actually meant to me till that moment at the switch. Then it came like a lightning flash. I knew I couldn't live without you, that if I couldn't pull you loose in time I'd have to die with you. I admit it bowled me over, knocked me silly. I couldn't get my bearings for a while. That's why I acted like a mule. But the thought that drove me to the tall timber was the awful one that you were going to die. I'd always hated the thought of it, but I supposed there wasn't any chance for you, so I put it out of my mind. Now I had to face it. You were under sentence of death and I couldn't live without you. When I came home last night, I had made up my mind that I'd take you to all the specialists in the world, that something surely could be done for you. I felt sure you couldn't be as bad as Dr. Trent thought, when those moments on the track hadn't even hurt you. And I found your note, and went mad with happiness, and a little terror for fear you didn't care much for me, after all, and had gone away to get rid of me. But now, it's all right, isn't it, darling? Was she, Valancy, being called darling? I can't believe you care for me, she said helplessly. I know you can't. What's the use, Barney? Of course, you're sorry for me. Of course you want to do the best you can to straighten out the mess. But it can't be straightened out that way. You couldn't love me. She stood up and pointed tragically to the mirror over the mantel. Certainly, not even Alan Tierney could have seen beauty in the woeful, haggard little face reflected there. Barney didn't look at the mirror. He looked at Valancy as if he would like to snatch her, or beat her. Love you, girl. You're in the very core of my heart. I hold you there like a jewel. Didn't I promise you I'd never tell you a lie? Love you. I love you with all there is of me to love. Heart, soul, brain. Every fiber of body and spirit thrilling to the sweetness of you. There's nobody in the world for me but you, Valancy. You're a good actor, Barney, said Valancy with a wan little smile. Barney looked at her. So you don't believe me, yet? I can't. Oh, damn, said Barney violently. Valancy looked up startled. She had never seen this Barney. Scowling, eyes black with anger, sneering lips, dead white face. You don't want to believe it, said Barney in the silk-smooth voice of ultimate rage. You're tired of me. You want to get out of it, free from me. You're ashamed of the pills and the liniment, just as she was. Your sterling pride can't stomach them. It was all right as long as you thought you hadn't long to live. A good lark. You could put up with me. But a lifetime with old Doc Redfern's son is a different thing. Oh, I understand. Perfectly. I've been very dense, but I understand at last. Valancy stood up. She stared into his furious face. Then, she suddenly laughed. You darling, she said. You do mean it. You do really love me. You wouldn't be so enraged if you didn't. Barney stared at her for a moment. Then he caught her in his arms with the little low laugh of the triumphant lover. Uncle Benjamin, who had been frozen with horror at the keyhole, suddenly thawed out and tiptoed back to Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles. Everything is all right, he announced jubilantly. Dear little Doss. He would send for his lawyer right away and alter his will again. Doss should be his sole heiress. To her that had should certainly be given. Mrs. Frederick, returning to her comfortable belief in an overruling providence, got out the family Bible and made an entry under marriages. Chapter 43. But Barney, protested Valancy after a few minutes, your father, somehow, gave me to understand that you still loved her. He would. Dad holds the championship for making blunders. If there's a thing that's better left unsaid, you can trust him to say it. But he isn't a bad old soul, Valancy. You'll like him. I do now. And his money isn't tainted money. He made it honestly. His medicines are quite harmless. Even his purple pills do people whole heaps of good when they believe in them. But I'm not fit for your life, sighed Valancy. I'm not clever, or well-educated, or... My life is in Mistawis, in all the wild places of the world. I'm not going to ask you to live the life of a society woman. Of course, we must spend a bit of the time with Dad. He's lonely and old. But not in that big house of his, pleaded Valancy. I can't live in a palace. Can't come down to that after your blue castle, grinned Barney. Don't worry, sweet. I couldn't live in that house myself. It has a white marble stairway with gilt banisters and looks like a furniture shop with the labels off. Likewise, it's the pride of Dad's heart. We'll get a little house somewhere outside of Montreal, in the real country, near enough to see Dad often. I think we'll build one for ourselves. A house you build for yourself is so much nicer than a hand-me-down. But we'll spend our summers in Mistawis, and our autumns traveling. I want you to see the Alhambra. It's the nearest thing to the blue castle of your dreams I can think of. And there's an old-world garden in Italy where I want to show you the moon rising over Rome through the dark cypress trees. Will that be any lovelier than the moon rising over Mistawis? Not lovelier, but a different kind of loveliness. There are so many kinds of loveliness. Valancy, before this year you've spent all your life in ugliness. You know nothing of the beauty of the world. We'll climb mountains, hunt for treasures in the bazaars of Samarkand, search out the magic of East and West, run hand in hand to the rim of the world. I want to show you it all. See it again through your eyes. Girl, there are a million things I want to show you, do with you, say to you. It will take a lifetime. And we must see about that picture by Tierney, after all. Will you promise me one thing? Asked Valancy solemnly. Anything, said Barney recklessly. Only one thing. You are never, under any circumstances or under any provocation, to cast it up to me that I asked you to marry me. Chapter 44. Extract from letter written by Miss Olive Stirling to Mr. Cecil Bruce. It's really disgusting that Doss' crazy adventures should have turned out like this. It makes one feel that there is no use in behaving properly. I'm sure her mind was unbalanced when she left home. What she said about a dust pile showed that. Of course, I don't think there was ever a thing the matter with her heart. Or perhaps Snaith or Redfern or whatever his name really is fed purple pills to her, back in that Mistawis hut, and cured her. It would make quite a testimonial for the family ads, wouldn't it? He's such an insignificant-looking creature. I mentioned this to Doss, but all she said was, I don't like collar ad men. Well, he's certainly no collar ad man. Though I must say there is something rather distinguished about him, now that he has cut his hair and put on decent clothes. I really think, Cecil, you should exercise more. It doesn't do to get too fleshy. He also claims, I believe, to be John Foster. We can believe that or not, as we like, I suppose. Old Doc Redfern has given them $2 million for a wedding present. Evidently the purple pills bring in the bacon. They're going to spend the fall in Italy, and the winter in Egypt, and motor through Normandy in apple blossom time. Not in that dreadful old Lizzie, though. Redfern has got a wonderful new car. Well, I think I'll run away, too, and disgrace myself. It seems to pay. Uncle Ben is a scream. Likewise Uncle James. The fuss they all make over Doss now is absolutely sickening. To hear Aunt Amelia talking of my son-in-law, Bernard Redfern, and my daughter, Mrs. Bernard Redfern. Mother and father are as bad as the rest. And they can't see that Valancy is just laughing at them all in her sleeve. Chapter 45. Valancy and Barney turned under the mainland pines in the cool dusk of the September night for a farewell look at the Blue Castle. Mistawis was drowned in sunset lilac light, incredibly delicate and elusive. Nip and Tuck were cawing lazily in the old pines. Good Luck and Banjo were mewed and mewing in separate baskets in Barney's new, dark green car en route to Cousin Georgiana's. Cousin Georgiana was going to take care of them until Barney and Valancy came back. Aunt Wellington and Cousin Sarah and Aunt Alberta had also entreated the privilege of looking after them, but to Cousin Georgiana was it given. Valancy was in tears. "Don't cry, Moonlight. We'll be back next summer. And now we're off for a real honeymoon." Valancy smiled through her tears. She was so happy that her happiness terrified her. But, despite the delights before her, the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, lure of the ageless Nile, glamour of the Riviera, mosque and palace and minaret, she knew perfectly well that no spot or place or home in the world could ever possess the sorcery of her blue castle. The end.